Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Met Dazai and Chuuya? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Dazai Osamu and the UA entrance exam. Dazai Osamu had taken down armies. He had. Single-handedly. Well, almost single-handedly. But in this case, the other party in question was Chuuya, who was less like a helping hand and more like an appendix in that he was relatively useless and tended to explode at the most inconvenient moments. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Dazai had taken down armies single-handedly. He was a master, a powerhouse, the leader of the infamous Double Black. For goodness sake. After all, one of them had to be the leader, and it wasn't going to be Chuuya. Again, he was less like the head and more like the appendix. The appendix while it was going through the first stages of rupturing at that. Dazai sighed. He really needed to stop thinking about Chuuya of all people during perilous situations. From his position crouched behind the remains of a bench, he surveyed his surroundings. What once resembled a cityscape had transformed into mountains of ash and debris. They littered a ground of torn-up concrete, rendering it completely invisible. Towering glass buildings and brick-layered shopfronts were unrecognizable amongst a sea of wreckages. The scene spanned out before him like a panorama. Somewhat beautiful in its hopelessness, he mused. Sounds of destruction echoes of the chaos ahead blared around him like alarms. But all of the fighting was blocked from his view. It served to make the experience seem slightly surreal. Dazai's lips twitched upwards, minutely. It was a stupid situation. He had taken down armies single-handedly. He was a master, a powerhouse, the leader of Double Black. And yet here he was, taking a goddamn high school entrance exam. Sure, he was 15, and this was what normal 15-year-olds did. But for the reasons stated above, Osamu Dazai was not a normal 15-year-old. At least, he supposed, the high school was not normal either. UA High School for Heroics was a lot of things, but normal was decidedly not one of them. Pulling at the sleeves of his black coat, Dazai stood up from his shelter, languidly. He had racked up a couple of points in the entrance exam so far, but not nearly enough to ensure a spot in Class 1A. The test was, unfortunately, not well suited to his abilities. If you asked Dazai, it actually felt like a strange form of discrimination or at least an oversight on the part of the UA exam coordinators. The written test had gone according to plan. Dazai had littered a few inaccuracies amongst otherwise flawless paragraphs, penned an error or two into his formulas, and there was no doubt in his mind that he would be given a percentage in the low 90s. The practical test was, in a sense, going to plan too. But it pissed him off that he'd even needed to concoct a plan to beat this ridiculous challenge. Whoever had chosen massive robots as the targets deserved to be fired on the spot, in Dazai's humble opinion. In what world did heroes have to fight giant, mechanical foes rather than real villains? Humans with hands to be forced, hearts to be manipulated, and, notably, quirks to be nullified? There was no use dwelling on it now, Dazai knew, but that didn't stop him from feeling somewhat disdainful. He did, however, have a plan to rack up some points. A plan that, as the clock ticked down to show 3 remaining minutes and the head of a somehow even bigger robot broke up the skyline, could only now come into fruition. Dazai dusted down his shoulders before starting a light jog towards his destination. He wondered, briefly, how Chuuya was doing before forcing the thought from his mind. He had a job to do. Nakahara Chuuya and the UA entrance exam. Fuck yeah. Ask the Chuuya of last week what he'd be doing on Wednesday morning and he'd probably suggest a couple of answers. Maybe trying different teas with Koyo, unfortunately not. Training his martial arts with the black lizards, thankfully not. Or even out on a mission with Dazai, closer to the truth than one might believe. In the most literal sense, though, he was beating up huge, killer robots in a high school, surrounded by amateur quirk users and in an arena about a kilometer away from his least favorite suicidal bastard. Honestly, he was having a pretty great time. He leapt over the roof of another building, legs propelling him, gravity pushing him up. Crushed a robot beneath his palm, almost absent-mindedly, as he swung through the city. A voice in the back of his mind was telling him not to overdo it, not to differentiate himself too much from the pack of frankly pathetic middle schoolers around him. But really this was just too easy. Plus, the voice sounded an awful lot like Hiratsu's, and that was reason enough to disobey in itself. Chuuya couldn't help but think back to why he was even here in the first place as he flew. Red locks tangled around him. The breeze caressing his face felt like falling in love. Dazai and Chuuya-kun, thank you for coming to see me on such short notice. Mori Ogai's office was quiet for once. Elise was nowhere to be seen. That was the first sign that whatever had prompted this meeting was serious. Chuuya shared a glance with Dazai, who had clearly come to the same conclusion. The office hadn't changed since the last time Chuuya had been in it, almost 3 months ago. All high ceilings and a long, mahogany table that appeared to be antique. Even though the room overlooked an expansive view of Yokohama, it still held a certain darkness to it that was yet to be chased out. No problem, boss, Chuuya replied, hesitantly. Dazai had that look in his eyes, the one he got whenever he saw Mori, so it was probably best not to let him engage. What can we do for you? Mori tilted his head slightly as he gazed at Chuuya, lips contorted into a smirk and hands rested gently on the arms of his chair. He seemed almost impressed, Chuuya thought, as he took the initiative. I'll admit that this is a bit of a strange one. Not difficult as such, but certainly out of the ordinary. Mori stood up, approaching the huge window beside him. The introduction seemed to have piqued Dazai's interest, but Chuuya just felt cold tendrils of dread curl up inside him. Abruptly, Mori turned to face them. Yokohama has seen a higher number of hero patrols since January than it did in the entirety of last year. The spring picture painted outside showed it to be April, and Chuuya felt an involuntary shudder pass through him. He had noticed some sort of influx in heroes lately, but to think it was so drastic? Needless to say, this is not ideal. For both the Port Mafia as an organization, and in a wider sense, the citizens of Yokohama, who have thoroughly rejected a hero-led society since the drawing of the quirk era. His hands were clenching into fists, his teeth gritting tightly. The very word hero brought about a gut reaction. It twisted his insides like wringing a wet towel. Before he could act out, Dazai finally stepped in. His voice was cool and calm in the way it always was when he addressed Mori. I don't see how Chuuya and I come into this. Killing all the heroes who walk into the town wouldn't exactly solve our problems. It was a little strange, Chuuya observed, to hear Dazai speak like that. He seemed guarded somehow. Defensive in a way that hinted at protectiveness. You're right. That would only sever the Yokohama Treaty, and thus the government and Hero Council's leniency. What I have in mind for you two is, he trailed off, tilting his head. A little more specific. So yeah, for reasons that Chuuya still had yet to puzzle through, he and Dazai were being enrolled in the most prominent hero school in Tokyo, maybe even all of Japan. To infiltrate the fundamental essence of hero society, Mori had said. To create a foothold in the next generation of heroes. Still, the logic didn't quite add up. Chuuya was certain that there was another factor somewhere, another reason that Mori was keeping hidden. He supposed it wasn't his job to question, but to act. The other entrance candidates were an interesting bunch, he thought, absent-mindedly. An honestly psychotic blonde guy was blowing everything up. A semi-Martian-looking girl was secreting odd fluids from her hands. If a drop got on Chuuya's hat, he would freak the fuck out. Not to mention the disembodied school uniform he had seen wandering around. Her quirk wasn't really suited to this exam, though, so Chuuya doubted he'd see her again. It was the flashier ones that had the advantage, his own and Explosion Kids over there. He briefly spared a thought for how Dazai was doing, but let the idea wash over him. If anyone could power through this exam, basically quirkless, it was that bastard. He crushed another robot as the timer ticked down to its final seconds. A gong sounded, the noise resonating around the partially destroyed cityscape, and all the robots came to a halt. A voice chimed over speakers that must have surrounded the arena. The UA practical exam is over. Candidates in arenas A, B, and D should advance to their nearest exit point where a pro hero will be waiting to escort them out. Candidates in arenas C and E should remain in their position and wait for a pro hero to reach them due to large amounts of debris in the arena making movement unsafe. Suppressing a laugh, Chuuya joined the stream of kids walking towards the exit gate. Dazai was in C. And in all likelihood, he was absolutely fuming. As he walked, he noticed a figure ahead of him. Not because they stood out particularly among the throngs of mutants and weirdos, but because they were moving in an odd manner. Limping. Pushing past a couple of chattering students, Chuuya reached the boy's side. He appeared relatively normal at first glance, tall and toned, with bright red hair styled in a strange, spiky manner. If one looked closer, however, they would find an ocean of crevices lining his skin, and a hard substance akin to stones sprinkled over the tips of his fingers. The fading remnants of some sort of transformation quirk, perhaps. Honestly, he wasn't entirely sure why he wanted to help the kid out. Maybe all these hero students were rubbing their germs off on him. Maybe he was simply an alright person. Maybe the mission-oriented part of him wanted to get closer to a could-be classmate, or maybe something about a bunch of 15-16-year-olds training to carry the weight of the world just didn't sit right. "Hey man," the boy said cheerily, teeth baring in a smile. Chuuya glanced behind him quickly, but no one was replying. He realized, with a start, that he was the man in question. Hi," he said as the other boy laughed good-naturedly. He clamped down on the blood that was rushing to his cheeks. "My name is Kirishima." Kirishima held his hand out to shake. "I'm Nakahara, Chuuya." Chuuya shook it. "Are you alright there? You're walking a bit?" Kirishima grinned. "Don't worry about me, dude. My quirk is pretty defensive, so I had a tough time with the exam. Don't get me wrong, though, I'm hopeful." He beamed, punching Chuuya's arm lightly as they approached the gate. "Thanks for asking. That was pretty manly." They parted ways after that. But the conversation didn't leave Chuuya's mind. It was weird, interacting with another kid his age. One who wasn't a complete headcase like Dazai, or codependent like the sheep had been. He stuffed his hands in his pockets as he walked away, grinning. Lingering by the huge gateway to UA, Chuuya decided to make his way back to his and Dazai's apartment, Mafia Perks, alone. Couldn't have the asshole think Chuuya was worried about him or something. Dazai Osamu and the UA entrance exam. He plan had originally been born following a patented Dazai plotting session. He had been curled up on the lime green couch, the one that he'd spent all his savings on, with his laptop on the table in front of him. Chuuya had been digging through the fridge, occasionally calling out a dinner suggestion. Stretching his fingers, he hunched over the laptop, taking to the search bar. The entrance exam. Naturally, he went straight to the All Our Might Hero blog. He scrolled through the topics until he found a list of previous entrance exam subjects, just begging to be analyzed. Hero list of all the UA practical exams since 2160. Quirk presentation to panel of pro heroes, 2160 to 72. Dummy hostage situation, 2173, 77, 80. Obstacle course, 2174, 76. Fighting robots, 2175. Laser tag style game, 2178, 79. What are our predictions for 2181? Copying the list, Dazai transferred the information to a spreadsheet. A couple more clicks got him the GDP of Japan for each year, the economic growth of Tokyo, and that of UA itself. It was hard to make any connections, but a scatter graph showed correlation pretty quickly. The richer UA was, the higher chance of a shiny new entrance exam. The statistics seemed relatively unsurprising in hindsight, and was decidedly vague. But given the situation, it was quite powerful. Recently, All Might had been somewhat absent in the world of heroics. Many people assumed that he had something important brewing, but rumors about possible retirement had been circulating as well. The worth of Tokyo had dropped noticeably as a result, suggesting to Dazai that an exam would be recycled. His next hint was an article that had been published 6 months prior. UA Heroics School clamps down on leaking information. It may seem as though UA High School has an open relationship with the public and the media, but earlier today, this was called into question. The school, famous for its successful alumni and teachers, as well as its annually televised sports festival, has recently been trying to reduce the amount of information being made known to the general public. Although not to much success. In the press conference held last Saturday, Head of Public Relations, Pro Hero Present Mike, commented that, at the end of the day, UA is still a school to which pupils entrust their personal details. Details which absolutely must remain secure and private. Additionally, exam coordinator Yamaguchi Yuta stated, although UA aims to effectively communicate with citizens and heroes, as in any organization, a certain level of secrecy must be maintained. This article concatenated with his previous deduction was enough for Dazai to conclude that the next entrance exam would surely be the path least traveled, the robot fighting exam. Possibly with a twist. Dazai let an evil grin overtake his face, before it was promptly wiped off by a flying cushion and a call of, "Stop being so fucking creepy." And that was how Dazai found himself in the current situation, ready to put the plan he had painstakingly formulated from his previous calculations into action. The UA exam consisted of 4 types of robots. The one-pointers, no larger than a 2-story house and with poor combat ability, the 2-pointers, slightly larger than a 2-story house and with adequate combat ability, the 3-pointers, definitively larger than a 2-story house and with decent combat ability. Followed that. Next would come a 4-pointer, but this was not the case. Finally came the 0-pointer robot, of which there was only one. It was probably about the size of a 3-story house, and had gigantic firepower. It was, however, notably slower than the other robots. Dazai supposed that anything of such a size was never going to be agile. The whole concept of the 0-pointer robot had immediately seemed strange to Dazai when it was introduced. Why bother? No one in their right mind would try to fight it, so it would just lumber around taking swipes at candidates. Anyone with decent coordination or any basic survival instincts should be able to get away from it just fine. This robot wasn't meaningless. No, very few things in life are meaningless. It also wasn't a trick or a trap of any sort. This robot was something of a get-out-of-jail-free card. It had to be. Being able to beat the 0-pointer would be impressive for an untrained 15-year-old. They would stand out from the crowd. Perhaps rather than 0 points meaning worthless, it actually meant priceless. Perhaps it was a shortcut to success. Or a way for a candidate previously low on points to stand out to the teachers. The point system itself suggested that candidates with the highest number of points would receive a pass, but it was never explicitly stated. Dazai had formed his plan entirely around this basis, and continued running towards the 0-pointer in the distance. A makeshift spear that he had salvaged from the debris earlier remained tight in his grip. His plan was not actually to defeat the 0-pointer himself. No way in hell. There were 2 reasons for this. One was that the brains didn't do the dirty work, and the other was that he was pretty sure he physically couldn't. No, he would play the role of the head. Find some do-gooder willing to be his appendix, or arm, or even elbow given that they had enough jabbing power to fight for him. Then take the final kills, call it teamwork. When the teachers later traversed their database, searching for the recorded name of the killer of the 0-pointer, boom. Dazai Osamu at your service. For any other robot, his plan would probably get him beaten up by some 15-year-old hero wannabe. For the 0-pointer, it was perfect. There were literally no points to be beaten up over. Most of the kids here probably didn't even realize that the robots contained a special mechanism to record their killer. Dazai had seen the little device before though, and recognized it instantly upon his first kill. He skidded up to the monstrous form of the 0-pointer, coat flapping behind him. His eyes locked on a small bluish figure that was charging towards it. Perfect. Narrowing his eyes, Dazai took a closer look at the kid that was clearly preparing to engage the robot. He was a little small for his age, a little trembly, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes that gave Dazai a spark of hope for him. He was dressed in what Dazai assumed was his previous school's PE kit, mangled though it was, and, somewhat prematurely, gray bangs gathered around his eyes. Choppy in length. Dazai ignored the sounds of chaos around him, and scenes of kids desperately running away from the path of the worthless 0-pointer. He himself focused on the bangs kid. He watched as a transformation began to take place, and cerulean sparks shot off from the boy's form like lightning. They twirled and fizzled, and eventually began swirling around the boy in unison. Slowly, behind the curtain of sparks, he began to change. His form, coloring, size, everything warped. When Dazai's view was no longer obscured by the curtain, there was no sign of the boy from before. Except for a single spark in those steely eyes. He had become a tiger. Dazai whistled, watching as the tiger crouched down, ready to pounce. That was a pretty sexy ability. Dazai briefly found himself pondering over whether Mori would like it. It had been clear to Dazai that he and Chuuya hadn't been told all the details about their mission. Maybe this was the final reason for it. Some sort of recruitment method? The idea was still flawed though, and Dazai let it go to rest. The tiger sprung. Suddenly and rapidly. The sheer weight of it halted the robot in its monotonous forward movements. Razor-sharp claws left grooves in metal. The robot aimed its huge, mechanical arm at the tiger on its chest, but he retreated back to the ground before it reached him. The robot recovered quickly, even as scraps of metal curled and peeled away from its new wound. The tiger growled. "Hey, tiger boy." Abruptly turning to look around for the caller, the tiger turned its back on the zero-pointer. That was when it chose to strike. Dazai gritted his teeth. He swung into action, sprinting towards the pair and deflecting the incoming hit with his spear. The tiger watched him, slightly startled. Even if he was clearly a bit of an idiot, he was, at least, lucid in tiger form. That was important. Dazai turned his head to the tiger, keeping his spear out in front and at the ready. He had beaten 4 one-pointers and 3 two-pointers throughout the exam. It was a pretty measly number overall, but had given him plenty of time to dissect and investigate the engineering of the robots after each kill. The circuit board is located in the neck, just above the left shoulder. That's where we need to target. Something between a growl and a purr came out in response, and Dazai had to stifle his laugh between bandaged fingers. "I'll cover your right, so go," he shouted. At his words, the tiger sped off to the left. He dodged and weaved around the robot, a dance interspersed with attacks. His nimble movements had completely outclassed the zero-pointer, and Dazai allowed a small voice in his head to praise the boy. The tiger started throwing in attempts to race up the tiger's left arm. He was constantly swatted at and forced to abort. However, they were making slow progress. Meanwhile, Dazai was spinning his spear. He deflected attacks and stabbed at robotic joints. 60 seconds were left on the clock. Dazai cursed. The pair kept working, kept weaving, perhaps slightly frantically. In fact, Dazai noticed the tiger's movements become messier and messier, less targeted and more outright feral. Fewer hits landed, and Dazai was getting frustrated. It was when the robot actually succeeded in its counterattack that Dazai came to a realization. Mechanical claws from the left slashed through fur, coloring snow crimson, and the tiger let out a distressed roar. "Tiger! Get your dash!" Dazai stopped, flawed by what he saw. The tiger had turned to face him, marred by blood, and for a split second, Dazai hadn't recognized the thing. That clarification, the bright, steely lucidity that had colored its eyes, that was gone. Replaced by an animalistic haze. It reminded Dazai of Chuuya during corruption. Completely unreachable. Ignoring him again, the tiger continued its attacks. The clock was down to 10 seconds, and Dazai knew what had to be done. He ran in towards the tiger, using his spear as shelter. 5 and he lunged towards the tiger. 4, 3 and he dodged away from the tiger's swipe, suddenly aimed at him. He narrowly avoided the attack, but his otherwise pristine coat was not so lucky. 2, 1 and his outstretched fingers made contact with the reddened fur of the tiger. A gong rang out as no longer human surrounded the tiger like water. He was a boy again. The robot powered down before him. The exam had ended, and Dazai felt regret well up inside him like poison in his veins. He had failed the exam. He must have. He had never really failed a mission before. He let himself wonder what Chuuya would say, what Mori would, and resigned himself to jumping off the nearest bridge rather than listening to it. "Thank you so much," a voice whispered almost to itself. It could barely be heard over the instructions telling him to wait in place. He was utterly seething about that. What kind of idiot couldn't move past a little debris? And why did Yue care for their health all of a sudden now? Don't worry about it, Dazai sighed. Is your cut all right? The boy ran a hand over the bloodied rip in his back. It's fine. The tiger has regenerative abilities. He shrugged, looking a little uncomfortable about it. Dazai nodded, committing this boy to memory. Dazai Osamu. Dazai stuck out his hand. The boy blinked a couple of times, before a look of realization passed over him. Oh, that's your name? Yes. And it's only polite to give me yours now. Or did they not teach basic manners in the jungle? I hear it's all a little savage down there. Dazai let his lips quirk up. The boy laughed. It's not Kojima Atsushi. They shook hands. Atsushi glanced down at Dazai's. You're pretty bandaged up. Is everything okay? Dazai didn't get a chance to say his usual no it is not. They were interrupted by a dark figure walking towards them. A pro hero, Dazai knew, but one that he recognized only from blurred flashes circulating on hero blogs. Eraserhead. A vigilante-type hero with a quirk similar to Dazai's own. His white capture weapon hung around his neck like a scarf, stark against an otherwise black ensemble. His long hair was wild and unruly, blowing this way and that in the wind. Dazai wasn't sure what he expected from the hero, but a calm, perceptive demeanor wasn't it. He spoke into a headset as he approached. Only 2 of them in area beta. I'll take them to the gate now. He waited for an affirmation before turning to them. Silently looking them over, he tilted his head in the universal, follow me gesture. Congratulations on completing the exam. If you are in need of medical attention, please follow the clearly marked arrows to Recovery Girl's office. If not, please sign out at reception and then leave the premises, the man said. His tone was drab and tired, his words routine. Eraserhead looked kind of like he wanted to die, which was relatable. Atsushi nodded, thanking the man as they followed him away from the powered-down zero-pointer robot. Dazai only had time to give it one more hate-filled glare before it was completely out of sight. I'm sorry about your coat, Atsushi mumbled as they walked. Dazai looked down at the long rip that was splitting the tail of his coat in 2, and laughed. He had forgotten all about it, what with most of his energy going into wondering how Mori will react when Dazai inevitably receives his UA rejection letter. He felt his hand shake at his side, and balled it into a fist. Drawing his expression into a mask of arrogance, he replied, words easy. It'll cost you 20,000 yen. Atsushi started spluttering with a passion, and Dazai grinned again. Just kidding. I hate this old thing anyway. Black is so last season. Atsushi breathed out an almost comical sigh of relief. I would like to ask you a question though. What happened out there? It was a rather ambiguous question, but Atsushi seemed to catch on given his quickly reddening cheeks and minute grimace. Dazai figured that if he was going to get fucked over, he might as well know why. He felt Eraserhead's gaze brush over them lightly but ignored it. Sometimes, the tiger, Atsushi muttered, before pausing. Sometimes I don't control it. It controls me. Dazai saw red eyes, stark against a familiar face. Whenever I panic, something pushes its way out of me. Clawing up into my brain. Dazai saw blood around a beating heart, a god living through it. It takes me over completely. Dazai saw Chuuya in the boy with a beast inside him. That's why I want to become a hero. I want to control the tiger and myself. I want him to save people for me, rather than hurt them. Atsushi looked guiltily at the coat again, before turning to Dazai with a fire in his eyes. They were almost at the gate, and Eraserhead wasn't even hiding his contemplative gaze on the 2. Dazai shrugged. He said the words that he'd said to Chuuya days after their first meeting. That thing inside you? That's you too. And it's the most natural thing in the world. Then he added, oversharing much? Atsushi turned bright red. Honestly, something about Eraserhead's gaze on him had given Dazai hope, and he had saved his bridge-jumping exploits for another time. As it turns out, he and Chuuya didn't have to wait long at all to hear the results of the UA entrance exam. About a week afterwards, 2 matching envelopes arrived in the post. Given some reflection time, Dazai had taken up a rather philosophical view about his performance. If he got in, yippee-ki-yay. If he didn't, at least he didn't have to spend more time with Chuuya. He also took great pleasure in announcing this, and dodging Chuuya's half-hearted retaliations. There they stood, staring down at the two envelopes haphazardly splayed on the coffee table. A rare moment of silence lingered between them. Chuuya was the first to break, running a hand through his hair. I haven't been to school in like 5 years, but the feeling of getting exam results still fucks me up. Dazai grinned in response. He picked up the brown envelope addressed to Chuuya, tearing it open to a barrage of complaints. What the hell, asshole? Chuuya began tugging at the half-opened letter in Dazai's grip. Chuuya. So vicious. And you always say you're not a chihuahua? Give. That. At that moment, 3 things happened in such a short interval of time that they appeared to be simultaneous. First, with a final, definitive pull, Chuuya ripped the paper from Dazai's hands, just as the latter let go completely. Chuuya went careening to the ground, a string of curses leaving his lips. The envelope went down with him, its contents spilling across the floor. Next, a flash of light burst out from the fallen items. It was a bright, bluish shimmer that encompassed the whole wall in front of it. That doesn't seem natural. Finally, the shape of a man phased into the projected image, and a somehow familiar voice boomed out. Nakahara Chuuya, congratulations. Your combined scores on the written and practical assessments have allowed us to offer you a place at UA High. It only took Dazai a second to recognize the man in the video as his figure became clearer, taking on shape and color. An iconic hero suit was on full display, and beamed out in full force. It was none other than Japan's #1 hero, the symbol of peace himself, All Might. Dazai felt an odd twinge run through him. The sudden appearance of All Might both answered and asked questions. If the hero was affiliated with UA, it explained Mori's sudden interest in the school. But what was All Might's role in this? As virtual All Might talked through some basic admin, Dazai turned to look at Chuuya, surreptitiously. The other looked a little dazed. His eyes were narrowed in that way of his, and head tilted, allowing red locks to tangle before his eyes. All Might had always gotten to Chuuya, Dazai knew, for reasons that he had never really pushed to discover. Unbidden, his hand stretched out to tap Chuuya's arm. Nice of them to send an audio file, don't you think? Chuuya looked at him inquisitively. They probably figured that even a dog trained by such a spectacular owner must be illiterate. And then Chuuya was back, snapping and growling and petulantly focusing on the video. Dazai smiled. All Might was still speaking when he returned his attention to the screen. Total score is first place overall. A truly outstanding result. Your practical test score was tied first, and your written exam just edged you over the top. My most sincere and heartfelt congratulations. Chuuya twitched. A small, clicking sound left his lips. To Dazai, it sounded suspiciously like the sweet, sweet chime of a bell, marking his victory in a battle that he hadn't even been fighting. A surge of realization swept over him like a tidal wave. He slowly turned to face Chuuya, lips pulling into a smile involuntarily. After a moment, the other noticed him. What? You were going all out, weren't you? Chuuya looked confused for a moment, before his eyes cleared, and then widened in horror. No. That would have blown the mission dash. You were going all out. And you tied for first. With a middle schooler. I was not going all out, Chuuya yelled. Dazai stifled a laugh behind his fist. And what about you, shitty Dazai? Did you even make it in at all? Dazai pouted at Chuuya's victorious look. Guess we're about to find out, he sighed. How do I shut this guy up? He's been talking for like 20 minutes. There's nothing more to say. After failing to control the device for a couple of seconds, Dazai simply crushed it under his shoe. The video instantly turned off. Chuuya looked like he wanted to complain, but ultimately couldn't fault the efficient method. He picked Dazai's envelope off the table more gently. Peeling it open, he studied the recorder inside. It was completely black and smooth, free of any buttons or obvious control panels. He just set the rectangular device onto a coaster, and they waited for it to begin. It only took a couple of seconds for the same blue light and mountainous figure to appear on their wall again. Dazai Osamu? Dazai looked away. Congratulations. Your combined scores on the written and practical assessments have allowed us to offer you a place at UA High. He stilled. What? A grin started to pull at the corners of his lips. Fuck yes, Chuuya hooped, arm thrown around Dazai's shoulder. Now Mori won't murder you and incinerate your body. Dazai laughed. A shame really. And they continued to watch the All Might on screen. Closer than they had Chuuya's, taking in all the information. Dazai was slightly surprised to find that they seemed to have personalized all the videos, not just Chuuya's first place result. You might dash. Chuuya audibly gagged at the All Might's pun. Be wondering how your score qualified you. Well, not only was your written test of tremendous success, but your practical score was likely higher than you expected too. He inhaled. UA is a high school for heroics. First and foremost, to be a good hero, you need the ability to put others above yourself and act to protect them, even to your own detriment. We are aware that our entrance exams are often poorly suited to candidates with non-combat specific quirks. And because of these reasons, rescue points were born. Dazai nodded slowly, pondering the concept. Honestly, it hadn't been too far off from his own predictions concerning the zero-pointer and Eraserhead's assessments of him. Still, it was a bit of a shock to hear. These rescue points seemed to be the internet's best-kept secret, though. Dazai had absolutely decimated all hero blogs to no mention of them. Rescue points are a parallel scoring system on the practical exam that are later combined with villain points and in some cases, a judging panel's assessment to create your total. Most students never receive or hear of rescue points, as they are given out very rarely. Each rescue point is worth 10 villain points. This brings your total practical score to 40 points. Chuuya was looking at him strangely. Brows furrowed. You're really dash. Chuuya faltered. And Dazai leapt on that moment of opportunity like a predator. I'm really? The ginger scowled, ripping his arm away from the other's shoulders. You're really schemy and manipulative. How the hell did you figure out that rescue points existed? Who even thinks about that shit? Laughing, Dazai stretched his arms out to the sides. Are you suggesting that I'm not just an upright young gentleman who saves others without thinking about the benefits? Or are you shocked that sometimes we can use our brains rather than our brawn to solve problems? He ducked just as the crushed remnants of Chuuya's entrance recording were flung at his head. Although really, this only served to prove his point. From then on, All Might said very little of interest, only telling them to read the rest of the contents of their envelopes in which they'd find forms to fill as well as various preparatory measures. When the tape shut off, they did as instructed. There were mainly admissions forms, but in Dazai's, he found a document requesting that he does not explain the concept of rescue points to any third parties. He supposed that was why the points had been practically wiped from the internet. Chuuya grabbed the burner phone that Mori had left them with from the drawer in his bedroom. It was a sleek, new thing, space gray in color and regular in size. He tapped out a quick message, his thumbs moving across the screen expertly. We both passed. And C in first overall. Dio received rescue points. All Might has connections to UA. Nothing else outstanding. A chime signaled a reply barely a minute later. Congratulations are in order. Chuuya, it is too late to recover your anonymity. Play up the #1 student role. Please integrate into the class as a reliable pillar. Dazai forge connections amongst not only the class, but also the student body as a whole. More instructions will be sent at a later date. Dazai blatantly adorned a look of revulsion as he read the message over Chuuya's shoulder. Eventually, he skulked back over to his forms as Chuuya returned the phone to the drawer. They were disrupted again only by Dazai's gasp. His eyes were widened almost comically as he stared down at a document. Looking up, Chuuya prompted him to explain himself. Chuuya, this is a form for hero costumes. Costumes? It's makeover time. Dazai was practically glowing with happiness, sprawled out on the carpet. We're not in a fucking Barbie movie, Chuuya retorted. Still, Dazai knew from the way he rolled over and readjusted himself on the sofa that he was hiding a smile. If there was one thing Dazai knew about the guy who dressed like a vampire fashion icon and hoarded dress shoes, it was that he loved a makeover. Please. We both know that the image of me and you prancing around in skin-tight suits is in your wet dreams. Chuuya choked on the air. You fucking dash. Hit a nerve? Dazai failed to avoid the television remote that came hurtling towards him. Now that hit a nerve, Dazai said, rubbing his cheek. Several pens later, Dazai held up a takeout menu they had ordered from the other night, proudly. An ink-stained sketch marred one corner. Chuuya leaned forwards, peering towards it. All black? Really? Chuuya asked, incredulous. If I saw someone coming at me in that, I'd run back towards the burning building or whatever. Dazai pouted. He had quite liked his hero costume design. It consisted of his usual long black coat, plus more pockets because practicality, and with a Kevlar lining because duh, a black athletic top and cargo pants, as well as black combat boots, heavy and strong but bouncy. Naturally, this was all topped off by bandages wrapped loosely around each article of clothing. The only part that wasn't black. Dazai fought pretty exclusively with guns, but he drew a few knives into the jacket pockets as well, for good measure. Chuuya sighed at the paper, ultimately resigned to his fate. You can keep the black underlayer, but the coat has to change. Then I think? What about bright pink with a high collar? Tan with a high collar, or I'm subscribing to loads of vegan recipe mailing lists using your email address? Scary. Scribbling out his prior drawing, Dazai reworked his sketch. It's still not very heroic. Chuuya rolled over on the sofa, kicking his legs about absent-mindedly. No, it's not. Don't most heroes have, like, a symbol of some sort? All Might has his logo thing. Endeavor's got his flaming mustache. Hawks has his fucking lit wings. Twirling his pen in thought, Dazai added a final je ne sais quoi to the drawing, holding it up again under the ceiling lamp. The addition was a small blue gem stone situated in the center of the chest. Chuuya nodded at it, approvingly. I think it's the closest you'll ever get to chic. I'll take that as the compliment it is. Now it's your turn. Dazai grinned, wickedly. It was only for a split second, but Chuuya stilled in his position on the couch. His lips pursed. A hero costume, huh? Dazai stayed silent, for once. He took his pen to paper again. He had finished a couple of minutes later, and waved the design at Chuuya. This time, he had gone for something closer to a bodysuit, but certain parts of it were more flared in style. The sleeves tastefully baggier before tightening again into gloves and the calves loose before reconvening at the thighs and ankles. The whole suit was a gradient of black and lighter gray, according to Dazai's shitty sketch, and orange detailing ran the length of it. Black boots and an orange cape added to the outfit, but what Chuuya noticed immediately was the headpiece. It consisted of night vision goggles pulled over a thick black band when not in use. The band covered his hair like a hat before running down to grip the sides of his face like black talons. For some reason, the existence of a headpiece was strangely touching to Chuuya. Chuuya, that look, are you finally accepting your true adoration for me? And the moment was gone. Chuuya scoffed, copying Dazai's design down on his form with some annotations before packing all the papers back into the envelope. Your attempt at drawing hands looks more like starfish was drained dry of even a modicum of water before being deep-fried and then blended in a food processor. That's definitely criticism, but I wouldn't call it constructive. In response, Chuuya simply sighed. He stood up and resigned himself to cooking dinner. Shigaraki Tamura on the end. Heroes and villains. So simple in their nature, so black and white, yes and no, that they're almost childlike. We live in a world that overcomplicates things of little importance and oversimplifies everything else. We're just too scared to face what matters, you see. We'd rather devote our time to surviving and then to dying. We assign meaning to everything, little, subconscious labels that sort us into lines and rows. What happened to the golden ratio? To the most beautiful, natural curve of all? Hero doesn't mean anything anymore. Maybe it did once. Maybe when it was just confined to the realms of fiction. Maybe when it was a should and not an is. An ideal and not a reality. Perhaps the problem lies not in the quest itself, not in the goal, but in the afterwards. What do we do after we finish the story? After we attain, achieve? There's nothing left for us after the end. But we all run towards it anyway. Principles? People who hold on to them are either privileged or suicidal. Killing is a means to an end, and the end is 3 letters and 3 million consequences. Dazai Osamu makes a friend. He first day was kind of like a punch to the gut followed by the words, "This is your life now." He had sat down at his desk next to a girl who was literally invisible, been verbally accosted by the return of a very enthusiastic tiger boy, who Dazai had quite frankly forgotten existed, and then witnessed a sexually charged brawl between some blonde kid and pretty much everyone else. Also, their form teacher was Eraserhead, who appeared to be semi-homeless, and he had immediately threatened them all with expulsion. But that said, the challenges he had put them through weren't exactly opportunities for imminent demise. There had been a running race, a ball-throwing test, and some other fitness checks that could be expected from a normal high school. Of course, the fact that students were allowed to use their quirks was somewhat abnormal, but definitely interesting to watch. Dazai internally noted any quirks that caught his attention and considered the wide array of, let's say, creative methods in which they were used. Immediately, Bokugu Katsuki appeared on his radar. The angry blonde who seemed to be constantly mid-battle. Not because of his quirk, powerful though it was, but more because of his intelligence. Given such an outrageous ability, many people would simply rely on that innate force, using obvious plans and attacks. Bokugu went deeper than that. He adapted his explosions for purposes other than pure firepower, such as speed. Momentum. He had a good head on his shoulders, although it was sometimes hard to see through the plumes of smoke. Todoroki Shudo was also one to watch. He was the opposite of Bokugu in that his quirk had immense strength, and he relied solely upon it. For now, that was fine, enough to propel him constantly to the podium, but soon, he would need to expand his repertoire. Whether he might decide if he'd fall or fly. The final interesting party came in an unexpected form, that of Midoriya Izuku. He was distinctly green, in both hair and quirk usage experience. His ability was clearly unbelievably powerful. So powerful that the sheer pressure of it literally crushed his bones upon use, and rendered his control about as acute as a toddler's. Watching Midoriya was fascinating. He was so determined that he was towing the line of suicidal. It begged the question of why UA had let him join the school in the first place. At the rate his bones were breaking, it seemed to be doing him more harm than good. Not to mention that Bokugu seemed to have a one-sided vendetta against him. God, what a mess. Dazai had the feeling, as emerald lightning crackled around the boy's fist, that Midoriya Izuku was more than he first appeared. The fitness tests ended with little ceremony and no expulsions, much to Dazai's disappointment. Chuuya, Bokugu and Todoroki had all congregated at the top, while he himself settled just below the average. He could have done better had he sabotaged his opponents, but he was undercover in a hero school. That probably wouldn't have fit the image he was trying to create. Atsushi had done pretty well, Dazai noted, although he wasn't sure why he'd bothered. The bell rang out, signaling lunch, as class finished up and Eraserhead dismissed them all with a flippant scrams gesture. The class immediately became abuzz with chatter, everyone high on the relief of avoiding expulsion. An expulsion that was realistically never going to occur. Now, Dazai may have been emotionally stunted and inexperienced in the ways of high school, but he wasn't completely out of the loop. He was well aware that lunch was a key socializing event. All the big players were out networking, building their web of allies from the get-go. He watched, a smile bound firmly to his lips, as small groups formed around the field and trailed one after the other towards the lunch hall. It was really quite a spectacle, how quickly people paired up. It was then that a familiar head of silver head bounded up to him. Sushi. Dazai-san, he called, turning a couple of curious heads. Dazai forcibly armored his smile to stop it from twisting into a grimace. Atsushi-kun. Please drop this san? I try to keep my general superiority on the down low. Atsushi just chuckled. He was quickly by Dazai's side, discussing the ins and outs of the quirk apprehension tests fervently. Everyone was calling it that, but to Dazai, the exercises had just seemed like an over-glorified sports day. Dazai shared a nod with Chuuya over the boy's head, and the others split off towards a different group. They had been told repeatedly not to associate too closely, too many links between them could spell trouble. I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, Atsushi said, more somber, as they sat themselves down at a table. He only expanded at Dazai's questioning look. About the tiger being a part of me. It's really helped me, Dazai-sen. I've been training differently and thinking differently. Atsushi trailed off with a self-deprecating laugh. It's so simple, and yet I never even considered it. Dazai smiled amongst the white noise of the cafeteria. Hundreds of students weaving between wooden tables and chairs, dishes clutched in their hands. It's harder to notice these things about yourself. Atsushi opened his mouth to reply, but someone else got there first. Najima-san, Dazai-san. Can we sit with you? In a fortunate turn of events, it was just the man that Dazai wanted to see. He marveled briefly at his own good luck. At his nod of affirmation, a mop of green hair slid onto the bench beside him, followed by Mr. Never Skipped a Leg Day and Gravity Girl, who had won the ball toss. Dazai quite liked Gravity Girl. She was smart and a little mischievous. More distinctly human than the others, who acted like a herd of sacrificial lambs just jumping for the chance to be first to the slaughter. Plus, Bakugo had exploded, metaphorically, this time, when a girl had beaten him at the exercise, which had been gratifying. Little did he know that the entire female population of the Port Mafia could have squashed him under their thumbs like a particularly annoying moth. Of course. And just Atsushi is fine, really? Rifling through his school bag for something, Midoriya grinned in return. Atsushi-kun, then I thought he paused as he pulled an object out of the front pocket. Your quirk was really awesome today. Is it all right if I ask you some questions about it? He had produced a compact, blue notebook with scrawling handwriting denoting his name on the front. Flipping through the pages, Dazai saw glimpses of jotted notes and pictures. Some sort of quirk journal, it seemed. He shouldn't have expected anything less from hero students. Yeah, I guess, Atsushi said, not unkind but a little surprised nonetheless. I've known Midoriya-kun for about 5 minutes and he's already stopped to ask 7 random students about their quirks and broken 2 fingers. I'm seriously considering going to the bathroom and never returning. That was Gravity Girl, lamenting in a painfully solemn manner. The effect was somewhat ruined by her cheeks being absolutely stuffed with food. Dazai laughed as Midoriya stuttered frantically, turning tomato red. What? It was only, like, 3 people. Maybe 4. Definitely not 7. A deeper voice spoke up then, Leg Boy. Let's see, there was Ibuki-san from 2A, Yamada-san from General Studies, Kuna-san from the Dash. Okay, they get it. We all get it, Ida-kun. Dazai chose that moment to interject. He fiddled with the cusp of his sleeve as he spoke. God, wearing uniforms was weird, and wore his brightest smile. You must really like quirks, Midoriya-kun, he chirped. Midoriya was nodding in relief, but Dazai was certainly not finished yet. In the same way that us normal people like celebrities and movies, he feigned a contemplative expression, fingers reaching up to brush his chin. Where I'm from, we call people like you. Gravity beat him to the punch. A nerd. The biggest nerd I've ever met. She held out her hand for a high five which Dazai took immediately and without hesitation. Atsushi-kun, Midoriya groaned, looking for some kindness amongst a pack of hyenas. We shouldn't bully him for his interests, guys, Atsushi said, gently. Surely his hair color is a far easier target? What about you? You literally have gray hair. How old are you really? I would rather look like an old man than vegetation. Ida-kun, vegetation seems a touch harsh. You think vegetation is bad? I just got compared to a pensioner. Oh, are you disrespecting your elders? Are you slandering the pillars of modern society? That's not what I meant and you know it. The conversation was interrupted by Gravity Girl choking on her food due to both her shoveling-style technique and her laughter. Various attempts at the Heimlich maneuver ensued with a healthy dose of meaningless chaos. There were about 5 minutes left of lunch break when their table came to a brief armistice. Other students were beginning to file out of the lunch hall. Dazai looked around casually, but couldn't spot Chuuya anywhere in the vicinity. He must have left. Dazai was considering doing the same, but Midoriya's notebook was still out and on the table, and his gleaming eyes told Dazai that he wasn't going to let his questions go so easily. He lounged back in his chair as Atsushi finished off his lunch, blissfully ignorant of the interrogation that would surely follow. It was funny, Dazai mused, absently. He had assumed that socializing with a group of All Might fans would be the worst part of the job, but so far, he could say with certainty that it had been the best. Nakahara Chuuya makes a friend. See, Chuuya may not be the boss, like Mori, an assassin like Koyo, or even whatever the fuck Dazai considered himself to be. But he was still a Port Mafia member, and he could tell when a pair of eyes were locked on him with all the deadly precision of a sniper gun. They had been pretty much since Chuuya first walked into his form room, immediately identifying a head of spiked red hair as a familiar and welcome sight. He had, like a gentleman, been trying to ignore the gaze. That had just become distinctly more challenging, though, considering that the eyes were no longer somewhere in the far distance. No, now they were directly in front of him and still fixed on him with a dedication that Chuuya could only describe as either creepy or really gay. How he had come to sit with Bakugo Katsuki of all people at lunch, Chuuya would never truly understand. Following the athletics tests, Chuuya had been bombarded with praise. A lot of the class seemed like lovely, agreeable people, and Chuuya was more than happy to join Kirishima and his makeshift group of friends for lunch. All had been going spiffily until Bakugo dropped his tray onto the table with a jolting thud. He hadn't said a word in reply to the stilted greetings offered up by Kirishima, Ashido, Kaminari, and Siro, instead choosing to hunker down on the bench and resume his staring massacre. Bakugo appeared to be the type to speak his mind, no matter the reception, so Chuuya was increasingly confused at the lack of communication. It was making them all uncomfortable, and he was going to put a stop to it. He flung his hair over his shoulder in an act of courage and vindication. She said, "Mina, you can't just bell hawks every time your deliver driver is a bit slow," and I said dash. "Do you have a problem with me?" Chuuya demanded. He internally apologized to Ashido, but kept his gaze locked onto Bakugo's. Guys like him didn't respond well to fear, they were similar to small dogs in that sense. Chuuya matched his challenge head-on, lips contorted into a frown. The others at the table were watching the showdown raptly. Even the buzz and chatter that filled the cafeteria seemed to soften into white noise as tension thickened into sap. Every tiny movement, every rise and fall of a chest or clench of a jaw registered in Chuuya's mind with an incredible clarity. His mafia training, he supposed. It flowed through his veins, had merged with his very being like oxygen diffusing into the cell membrane. "Why isn't he answering? Is he okay?" Kaminari whispered to Siro next to him. The latter simply facepalmed in response. Unfortunately, the nature of the silence at their table meant that the exchange could quite easily be heard by all occupants. A growl clambered up from the depths of Bakugo's throat. "Shut the fuck up, extra. This is between me and him." Something snapped. "Don't fucking talk to people like that. I thought you were here to become a hero, so act like it." Chuuya leant back in his chair and let his scowl slacken. Honestly, he just couldn't figure this guy out. "You were treating Midoriya-kun like shit earlier, but you had some history, fine. This has come from nowhere. I've never met you before in my life." A cough sounded from somewhere on the table. Rather than calming down, Bakugo looked more agitated than ever. Or maybe more uncomfortable than agitated. Chuuya tilted his head, looking at Bakugo like he was a particularly tough puzzle. Observing his every movement. It was funny. Anyone would assume that the Port Mafia were a somewhat violent and aggressive group of people, but this guy had most of them beat. Finally, Bakugo moved. He leant forwards, right into Chuuya's space. A fist banged down onto the varnished surface of the table. "Listen here, I don't like you and I don't trust you," Bakugo narrated, slowly and deliberately. "I saw you in the entrance exam, and that shit wasn't normal. Kids barely out of middle school shouldn't be able to do that." Chuuya felt himself tensing up, involuntarily. It was his first day. His first day. And already, someone had looked right through him. Seen through to his core and branded him as an outsider. As someone untrustworthy. He looked around to the others at the table, who were all shell-shocked. How long before it spread to them? Before the distrust became contagious, and that was when the laughter started. Ashido first, God bless her, and the others following one by one. A minute later and they were all practically in tears. Kirishima was doubled over after a particularly harsh inhale. "He was complimenting you. That was literally a compliment." Bakugo was fuming, but his complaints were growing less heartfelt, and as they went to clear their trays, Chuuya could swear he saw a hint of a smile color Bakugo's face. He spoke again as they were walking down the hall to their form room, the remnants of laughter floating through the air. I'm not asking for your hand in marriage, Baku-kun. If you don't like me, that's all right. If you don't trust me, Chuuya trailed off. A reliable pillar, Mori had said. If you don't trust me, we can work on that. It's not my fault I'm insanely talented. Exert less of your energy on being a dick and maybe you'll get to my level too. He smiled for good measure. Someday. A chorus of cheers rang out from behind him. Kaminari was especially enthusiastic, and Chuuya almost felt inclined to take a bow. As if I'd ever marry you anyway, hat fucker. The excitement from his friends only grew at that. He was almost certain, this time, as they walked into the classroom, Bakugo was smiling. Crisis averted. Their lesson that afternoon was an odd one. An introduction to hero marketing and self-promotion. It was probably a side of the heroics industry that most of his classmates had never really considered, and it was definitely the side that pissed him off the most. It just seemed to go so clearly against the spirit of the thing that the contrast was jarring. As Midnight, who was teaching the lesson, flipped through her PowerPoint, Chuuya gazed across rows of seats, mindlessly. He had situated himself near the back of the classroom, so people watching was a luxury he could afford. It was somewhat amusing how perfectly each student played into their various stereotypes. Ida and Midoriya were paying rapt attention to the board. Jairu had subtly plugged an earphone in. Tokoyami's gaze was directed somewhere outside the window. Chuuya took the moment to lament over how incredibly ridiculous the painted picture was. A whole class full of elite hero students. In Yokohama, such a class was an unwelcome pipe dream. Finding even a couple of kids with both the will and means to become a hero was challenge enough in itself. The only hero agency in Yokohama was the Armed Detective Agency, and whether or not they were heroes as such was debatable. They were really just a collection of civil servants that were licensed to use their quirks in public, and generally operated from the shadows. Like a more charitable version of the Port Mafia, Chuuya supposed. The lesson ended with a final question posed by Midnight. Coming up with an answer was their homework for the week, and she became uncharacteristically somber when she asked them each to consider the words carefully. Why do you want to be a hero? Well, truthfully, he didn't. Maybe once, such a thing had appealed to him, had meant something. Now, the word felt empty, and the dream was long withered. Chuuya left the classroom, feeling strangely burdened by Midnight's words. Dazai Osamu makes a friend. Teehee next day marked Class 1 as first real hero training lesson, and the excitement in the air was palpable. One, perhaps slightly superficial, reason for this was that it was their first opportunity to try on their hero costumes. The other was that All Might had strolled into their class as if that was completely normal, and introduced himself as their teacher. For Dazai, that had only raised the stakes. Fooling a bunch of untrained 15-year-olds into thinking he was your typical hero hopeful was one thing. Fooling the number one himself was a whole other story. Slipping his arms into tan sleeves felt weird, to say the least. Black had been his sole companion for years. Being without it felt almost like being completely bare. He forced a shutter down, and instead worked on attaching the blue gem to his chest using a harness-like string structure that the support course had built. He couldn't stop himself from looking over at Chuuya, who was finishing up on the other side of the changing room. His signature hat was off, and replaced by Dazai's goggle concoction. He looked good, Dazai could admit that much. If anyone asked, it was because of Dazai's own talent in fashion design. Are you three ready? This will surely be a testing but valuable challenge. Dazai had gotten used to Ida's stilted way of speaking and frankly insane hand movements through a culmination of conversations. Naturally. Isn't this what we all came for? Midoriya nodded in reply. His hands were fisted, and he looked a little shaky. His freckles stood out starkly against pallid skin like ink on paper. Dazai was tempted to ask after the other's health, but was stopped short. I'm ready. The words were solid, unyielding and caked in a mud-like conviction. Midoriya's body wasn't racked with nerves, but excitement. It made Dazai feel sick. It wasn't easy to unnerve him. He had shot real guns like they were merely video game depictions. Hated with such a deep resentment that hatred was as much a part of him as his own skin and bones. But this child, conditioned to become a weapon of mass destruction, conditioned to want to. This evoked a feeling that even blood-slicked hands couldn't conjure. They left the changing rooms, and Dazai pushed down a surge of dread with a meandering exhale. Explaining the rules was an ordeal in the way that most things at UA seemed to be. What was actually a very simple task, either be the villains and protect the bomb or be the heroes and fight your way to the bomb, was made to sound very complicated. Dazai watched the battle's progress with a casual sort of engagement, the type one might feel towards some vaguely interesting daytime television. First were heroes Atsushi and Uraraka versus villains Bakugo and Ida. The heroes started off well, developing a strategy that had Atsushi fronting the charge and Uraraka following up the rear and deploying guerrilla tactics. Their big mistake was thinking that Atsushi stood a chance against Bakugo. The former was talented, yes, but the latter was skilled. That subtle difference was exploited and the villains won the round. Bakugo even left a gaping hole in the floorboards of one of the rooms. It was on the second floor near the bomb, but All Might deemed it noticeable enough to be safely left without maintenance. Next up to the metaphorical chopping block were Todoroki and Hand Guy against Tail Guy. What was with these people and their plentiful limbs? And Casper the friendly fucking ghost. Needless to say, Todoroki decimated the game and secured a win in minutes. Tokoyami and Azui beat Kirishima and Siro next in a glorious display by Dark Shadow. Hero team, Yaoyorozu-san and Nakahara-kun, villain team, Kaminari-kun and Jiru-san, All Might said. Although simply speaking, for All Might was shouting for the rest of the world. Dazai watched from his perch on a chair as Chuuya headed towards the battleground, nodding to Yaoyorozu as she joined him. They made a funny pair, if only because Yaoyorozu towered over him as one of the taller girls in the class. Plus, while Yaoyorozu walked with all the elegance of the nobility, Chuuya trudged around like a delinquent. The screens in front of them crackled into life, displaying views of the front of the building, as well as various rooms inside where the villains were already situated. Said villains were prodding at their bomb in an attempt to push it. The idea seemed reasonable enough in that Chuuya and Yaoyorozu had already received the chance to watch multiple other groups try the same exercise, so they had advantageous knowledge of the building compared to other heroes. It was less reasonable in that their bomb was a huge metal cylinder, and without the aid of a super-strength quirk, no amount of pushing was going to move it an inch. Still, Dazai applauded Kaminari for trying. Sudden movement flashed on the monitor showing the exterior. The two heroes had previously been huddled together in front of the grimy walls of the tower block. Now, Yaoyorozu was pulling an object out of her chest. The grainy picture made it hard to tell what exactly it was, but Dazai's eyes narrowed in recognition. Even though there was no audio, Dazai could tell immediately that this was Chuuya's plan being set in motion. Brash and bold and considered. Thoroughly but not quite thoroughly enough. Rubber gloves, Midoriya mumbled from beside him. Dazai sighed. I wish Chuuya wasn't so very predictable. Midoriya looked at him, head tilted. Then realization spilt onto his features. You went to the same middle school as Nakahara-san, right? Dazai nodded. It was the lie the pair had agreed on. It would be impossible to avoid each other completely for the entire duration of the mission without garnering some suspicion. Best to tell a believable half-truth and be done with it. The hero team will lose. Eyes sharp and alert, Midoriya turned back to the screen. The heroes were making their way into the building now, Yaoyorozu splitting off and up the stairs, rubber gloves on her hands. Chuuya remained prowling along the bottom floor. Chuuya has already decided that he can't avoid falling prey to Jiru-san's quirk, Dazai narrated. His gaze never left the monitors even as Midoriya and a couple of other classmates blinked up at him. He's looking to exploit the fact that the villain team currently deem him the bigger threat. They probably agreed before starting that should the heroes split up, Jiru-san would prioritize tracking Chuuya. He wants to create a situation in which Yaoyorozu-san and Kaminari-kun can fight one-on-one, because she has the advantage. As he spoke, Jiru crept down the corridor, bypassing the stairs completely. She plugged her earphone jack into a wall and listened, solemnly. However, Chuuya has underestimated the perimeter of Jairu-san's ability. Or at least decided the hero team's combined strength can overcome certain aspects of it. Midoriya-kun, you must have asked how far away Jairu-san can hear using her quirk. Midoriya nodded, still watching the events play out before his eyes. She said she can hear everything clearly for about 50 meters in any direction. The building is less than 50 meters tall and relatively quiet. She doesn't need to focus on one hero or the other. She can track both. Movement on a screen that had been still up until then caught his attention. It was in the villain's base. A dull place, really, with water-damaged walls and dusty wooden floors. Kaminari was nodding as he listened to Jairu through their headset. Abruptly, he darted out of the room, into a small offshoot to the side. Meanwhile, Yaoyorozu ran down the hallway approaching the base, looking around guardedly. Is Kaminari-kun going to throw a surprise attack? That was Invisible Girl, back from her turn. No, Dazai replied with a smile, watching Midoriya shake his head as well, mumbling about the ineffectiveness of such a method. A surprise attack would be the least surprising move they could make. No matter what Kaminari-kun does, Yaoyorozu-san will be ready for him. But someone needs to protect the bomb. So there's only one option left. Yaoyorozu charged into the room, hands thrown out in combat stance and legs in a lunge. But other than the gleaming metal bomb, the room was completely empty. She seemed reluctant to let down her guard, but began walking towards the bomb anyway. On the bottom screen, Chuuya had been walking towards Jairu's corridor. A smirk pulled at his lips as he crossed the final corner towards her. How could they possibly lose from here? Ida asked, genuinely unsure. They'll lose. That was when Yaoyorozu's head snapped to the left. A noise had clearly alerted her to something being amiss. Acting frantically, she dived for the bomb, only needing to touch it to attain the victory. Her gloved fingers were inches away when something happened. Vibrations filled the air, even the camera picking up on the violent distortions. Yaoyorozu's body flailed in midair, being forcibly pushed back towards the corridor. Her hands clasped her ears tightly, her eyes watering. Then Jairu sprinted through the room, kicking Yaoyorozu's legs clean out from under her. Sound waves, Tail Guy gasped from behind Dazai. How the hell did Jairu-san get up there? I thought she was following Nakahara-kun. On the monitor displaying the ground floor, Chuuya rounded the corner, arms outstretched. The smile was wiped off his face instantly. Kaminari jumped out from behind the wall, lightning surrounding him like a shield, and grabbed onto Chuuya's arms tightly. Both fell to the ground. Chuuya was focused on his own advantageous knowledge of the building and his classmates. He has a tendency to overestimate himself, you see. He forgot that the villains also had knowledge of the battleground. Namely, the hole that Bakugo-kun created in the first round. Midoriya practically squeaked, his eyes widening. It's exactly above where Jairu-san was hiding. They swapped places while Nakahara-san and Yaoyorozu-san were distracted and got the advantage in both fights. Dazai beamed. Exactly. Typical Chuuya not to imagine that your opponents can also take opportunities given to them. Victory for the villain team, All Might shouted over the intercom. Although even he seemed a little surprised. Midoriya was staring at him like he had seen a ghost. Dazai-kun, that was amazing. You just predicted that entire match before it even began. Standing up from his seat and dusting his coat off, Dazai began walking towards the exit. His turn next. Bullying Chuuya for his humiliating failure could be a fun evening activity. I've had plenty of practice. I may not look like it, but I'm something of a crime drama fanatic. Midoriya laughed and jogged over. My mum is the same. He paused at the doorway, something clearly still on his mind. Dazai stopped as well, repressing a sigh. Hey, Dazai-kun, Midoriya began. What exactly is your quirk? All Might's instructions interrupted them. We're on to the final group, now. The hero team is Ishido-san and Midoriya-kun. The villain team is Dazai-kun and Sato-kun. Dazai grinned. I guess you'll find out, Midoriya-kun. Good luck. And off he went. The bomb was pretty realistic, upon closer inspection. Sleek and cold to the touch, marred by shallow scratches. It was nice handiwork, Dazai mused, as Sato exited the room. Dazai's plan had been mixed and seasoned with two basic facts at its foundations. 1. Midoriya and Ashido had watched all the previous battles. 2. Neither of them knew Dazai's quirk. Sato, although a sweetheart and a sweet tooth, was quite happy to simply follow instructions on the strategic front. He had popped a sugar cube into his mouth, committed Dazai's plans to memory and run off into position with a departing fist bump. Dazai had liked that. The only person who ever first bumped him was Chuuya, and those tended to be slightly more violent and painful than encouraging. It's easy to believe that we can't be influenced once we've made up our minds about something, but such a viewpoint is naive. Similarly, we like to imagine that external factors don't have too much sway over us. Again, we're wrong. Everything we see, watch, consume plants thoughts into our minds that cannot be pushed aside and ignored in their entirety. These thoughts have a tendency to narrow our viewpoints and entice us to act in ways previously presented to us. Ashido and Midoriya had witnessed each of the previous group's battle, and therefore saw all of the members split up before engaging in one-on-one fights. Midoriya seemed rather prone to getting stuck in his own head as it was. All the reinforcement of dividing and conquering would only amplify this effect. Dazai was certain of it. Ashido and Midoriya would not work as a team. In fact, they would completely overlook it as a possibility. Therefore, the most logical course of action for Dazai and Sato was to do exactly that. It was a little risky, as it would involve leaving the bomb unprotected, but Dazai had requested they move it to a different location between matches. He just hoped it was enough to stall Midoriya while they fought Ashido. Midoriya-kun is going up the main staircase. Ashido-san is along the bottom corridor. I'm going to meet her. Dazai responded with an affirmation. Sato's quirk was powerful but had low endurance. They needed to finish the match off as quickly as possible. In that sense, their defensive roles as villains was somewhat disadvantageous. He headed towards the back staircase, leaping down the floors to reach the bottom. Sato was already mid-battle, throwing punches and kicks with clumsy trajectory. Ashido seemed to be on her way to the triumph. She was quick. If Sato couldn't reach her, his super strength was rendered meaningless. Dazai hid in the doorway, unseen. He just had to wait for the right opportunity to act. The fight dragged on for another precious half-minute before he found a chance to interject. Sato had dealt a harsh blow to Ashido's left arm, and she was open. He charged forwards, fingers outstretched to Ashido's left. Their eyes met briefly, surprise etched into every line of her face. She secreted a pool of acid from her left hand just as Dazai reached her. Hissing lowly as the sting of the acid spread across the skin of his arm, Dazai watched the calming blue of no longer human engulf Ashido. He wished, briefly, that his powers could affect physical matter created by quirks, like Ashido's acid, but pushed the thought aside. Go, Sato-kun, he yelled. He didn't have to though. Sato was already swinging back his arm and dealing the decisive punch. He kind of liked this guy. Maybe he should replace Chuuya with this more obedient slave. The appendix. Whatever. Let's head up, Dazai said, not waiting to receive a nod before running back to the stairs. He listened to the thumping footsteps behind him as he tried to divert his gaze from the blistering patch of skin on his arm. That would leave a nasty scar. He hoped that Midoriya hadn't progressed too close to the bomb. It would be nice to have a second or two to recollect himself. Unfortunately, his prayers were not answered. Reaching the top of the staircase gave him an expansive view of the top floor of the building. Midoriya was striding towards the bomb, quirk in control, for once, and sparking around his legs. Now that he was observing from such close range, Dazai felt something like recognition pass through him. The lightning-like substance that he emitted, the super strength with a power that far surpassed any other quirk of a similar nature. There was a certain hero that came to mind at such descriptors. Before he knew it, Sato and Midoriya were locked in combat. But Sato was slowing down by the second, and Midoriya seemed to be getting bolder and bolder as all his bones remained intact. It was probably a bad thing to be wishing your friend's bones would break, right? Anyway, Sato was using his increased body surface area to shield the bomb from Midoriya, pushing him back. But for every one step backwards, it seemed to be two forwards for the hero. When Midoriya pulled a finger back for a flick, Dazai knew Sato wouldn't be able to counter. He went rocketing back into the wall behind him, a stream of concrete chips breaking off and clattering to the ground. Dazai stepped forwards, positioning himself between Midoriya and the bomb. Only 3 minutes left on the clock. He could drag this out. A voice in Dazai questioned why he even cared, why he wanted so desperately to win this trial. This game concocted for children. Although the rational side of him knew better, the deeper, most pungent part told him he should win everything. Defeat all his enemies. Perhaps it was his mafia mindset, or perhaps Dazai simply couldn't stand the flavor of defeat. Midoriya shuffled a leg forwards, but hesitated even in his minute movement. Dazai pounced on that split-second indecision. You've had plenty of time now, Midoriya-kun, and I'm sure it's been on your mind. So take a guess. Dazai grinned. What's my quirk? Midoriya didn't let his guard down, legs planted firmly in a defensive stance. Well, it's not an offensive quirk, or you would have found a way to use it in the quirk apprehension tests. And right now, that's all I need to know. Dazai laughed, leaning back against the bomb. It was a show of arrogance. Really, if Midoriya was to jump then, Dazai wouldn't have a hope in hell of stopping him. Midoriya-kun, I watched you interrogate Atsushi-kun about his quirk for a full 25 minutes. I could write a 7-page essay on the thing. I know more about his quirk than he does. He sighed. What I'm trying to say is, for you, knowing that my quirk is not offensive isn't nearly enough. It was working. For now, at least. There couldn't have been more than a minute and a half left on the clock. Dazai was banking on Midoriya's strategic mind stopping him from charging in without any background information, but he was beginning to look a little restless. Shifting about on the balls of his feet. Dazai's teeth gritted, even as he hid an amused exhale. Let me ask you something, Midoriya-kun. Why do you want to be a hero? Stilling wearily, Midoriya tilted his head at that. He was uneasy. I want to save people. From what? From villains. From criminals. People who want to harm them. Why are you asking me this? A second of silence. Has Bakugo-kun ever harmed you? Why are you suddenly bringing up Kaken? The very person that people need saving from is trying to become the savior. I can't tell if it's genius in its ludicrousness or just ludicrous. That was when Midoriya snapped. Dazai cursed himself for being careless. There must have been more going on between Midoriya and Bakugo than there seemed to be at surface level. He should have tried a different route. Too late now, he supposed, as Midoriya flew towards him. Green lightning filled the air as he propelled himself towards the bomb. Dazai met him halfway, literally pushing him backwards, square on the shoulders. Midoriya's quirk was nullified with a blue glimmer. He skidded backwards, faced the picture of astonishment. It bought Dazai a precious few seconds, but it wasn't long before Midoriya was back in the fight. Dazai wasn't going to lie, Midoriya was clearly trained to at least an amateur standard at combat, and he matched Dazai's skill level, if not improved upon it. A physical fight wasn't ideal, but was somewhat unavoidable. Midoriya had chosen to abandon the quirk route altogether. He caught Dazai in the stomach with a well-aimed punch, before narrowly dodging an uppercut. They danced closer and closer to the bomb. Surely, the time was approaching the limit by now. Dazai was coming to the end of his abilities. It was time to put his final plan into action. Hopping back, Dazai stood, spine pressed up against the bomb. Taking the opportunity, Midoriya rushed forwards. He must have known that Dazai wouldn't let him get a subtle touch of the bomb in, or maybe he just wanted a more definitive win. Either way, his fist was aimed at Dazai rather than the metal monster behind him. Dazai raised his right arm to block. And Midoriya stopped dead in his tracks. This was the arm that's during the fight with Ishido had taken a dosage of acid. Scar tissue was forming in reddened clumps. On top of the blackened edges of the coat sleeve and his bandages, it didn't make for a pretty sight. Even in attack mode, Midoriya's moral compass rivaled that of the most noble superhero. Maybe it was a dirty move, but Dazai was certain that Midoriya would pull his punch if he used his injured arm as the target. And Midoriya did. That second of hesitance cost him dearly. The time limit is up. As the heroes have failed to secure the bomb, the villains are victorious. Following the battle, All Might had ushered the four of them off to check in with Recovery Girl. Dazai felt bad for the poor woman. She must have been absolutely swamped with work. He knew that her quirk wouldn't have any effect on him, but he had tagged along anyway. All Might's quietly concerned insistence and his own curiosity magnetized him to her office. And maybe, just maybe, a tiny, minuscule part of him wanted to find Chuuya. To bully him, obviously. Was that so wrong? He was walking beside Midoriya, both of them drowning in the silence. It was strange. Considering his friend's habit of breaking bones and his own penchant for breaking people's mental health, one would imagine that breaking the silence would be an easy job. It was Midoriya who managed it in the end. He sighed, scuffing a red boot along the ground. I'm really sorry, Dazai-kun. I got completely, irrationally angry when you mentioned Kaken, and overdid it in the fight, he said, sincerely. Oh. Even before that, when you asked me why I wanted to be a hero, I don't know. I've answered it so many times before. And I've always meant what I said, he reassured Dazai, frantically. But sometimes I wonder if it's enough. Helping people it's the most important thing you can do. But you picked holes in my logic instantly. Am I even qualified to be one of these elite saviors we put on pedestals? Is anyone? Midoriya was midway into a full-on mumbling speech when they reached the nurse's office. Dazai didn't mind. In a way, he was just pleased to hear Midoriya thinking and observing for himself. You really have nothing to apologize for, Dazai said, grinning. It brought Midoriya back to the realm of the living with an embarrassed laugh. First off, we were in a training exercise simulating the roles of heroes and villains. If you hadn't gone all out in the fight, I would have been offended. He held out a second finger as Recovery Girl looked Sato up and down. Second, I didn't mean what I said about why you should be a hero. I was just trying to waste time, talking in circles. I know a lot of people and most of them are assholes. She faltered. Well, you're not. And that makes you pretty qualified, in my humble opinion. Midoriya smiled at him, gratefully. And finally, I shouldn't have bought up Bakugo-kun. Dazai threw his arms out, mournfully. I mean, for all I know, you're bullying him from the shadows. A violent choke sounded from beside him. Plus, the two of you are clearly in love. Dazai-kun, please. Recovery Girl walked in on Midoriya, turning an unhealthy shade of crimson. She ushered him over to a curtained-off area, mumbling about broken bones and the like as he stumbled along beside her. He only had to wait a few more minutes for his next goal to be satisfied. Hey, asshole. Come to gloat? A figure was approaching him from behind. He turned, moving from his comfortable position on an unoccupied bed. Chuuya, I'll have you know that I've come to deal with this. He held up his right arm. I forgot that you even existed the moment you walked out the room. Expecting Chuuya to keep up their cat-and-mouse game, Dazai was a little surprised when the former's features twisted in something. In pain, maybe? Concern? That doesn't look great, Chuuya tried, almost carefully. Are you okay? He joined him on the bed. Dazai looked in honey-brown eyes and couldn't see a hint of mockery. Chuuya had always been different, Dazai knew, to the other members of the Port Mafia. To the boss, that slimy bastard. To the black lizard, who murdered as naturally as they slept, ate, and breathed. Even to Koyo, who survived on the cruelty running through her veins, though she kept any outward malice clamped down and out of sight. Chuuya hadn't been born evil. I wonder which is wounded worse, my arm or your pride? You fucking dash. Surely, a kind, young hero in training such as yourself wouldn't hit an invalid? Chuuya visibly held back a twitch. Ooh, a twitch? That lightning strike hasn't given you any long-standing fine motor control issues, has it? It came out teasing. Chuuya saw through him. If I had fine motor control issues, who would cook dinner? We'd both fucking starve. Later, Dazai left Recovery Girl's office with multiple shiny new things. One was some gauze and fresh bandages neatly wrapped around his arm. Another was the phantom of a kiss on his cheek. Recovery Girl had said it wouldn't hurt to try. She had been wrong. That kiss had been mildly wet, incredibly unpleasant, and completely ineffective. And of course, Chuuya in tow. Shigaraki Tamura and the first attack. It makes me sick, Kurogyri. It makes me fucking sick. What makes you sick, Shigaraki Tamura? Everything. All of it. Heroes and villains and everyone in between. Everyone who simply buries their head in the sand whenever a problem arises. Everyone who uses heroes as an excuse to live their lives without working and fighting and loving. Who revels in the safety they say they provide. Shigaraki Tamura rose from his chair, abruptly. He dropped the newspaper he had been reading, letting it flutter to the ground. His entire body was on fire. His hands shook restlessly where he had pressed them to his sides. This world we've created is an illness, Kurogiri. It's the rash under my skin. Control yourself, Shigaraki Tamura dash. Fuck off, Shigaraki cried, whipping around to face the smoking form that constituted his ally. His information is good, reliable. I'm sure of it. Today we prepare. Soon, we march on the USJ. He bent down, slow and deliberate, until he was hovering over the newspaper that had gracefully landed beside him. All Might's beaming face stared up at him. Shigaraki felt that familiar mix of adoration and disgust. He wondered how strong it would become when he was face to face with the real deal. Why do you want to be a hero? Yokohama was an island. Perhaps not in the physical sense, but in every way that mattered. It was indignant and ever-evolving. A wind tunnel of ideas and emotions. It was a place that Chuuya adored in the most genuine sense of the word. Adored in a way that wouldn't let up or break down. Yokohama could detest him, could throw him into the depths of its raging waters or bury him in the blackened, charred earth which made up its very foundations. His feelings towards it wouldn't change. Whether it was just the kindness of the moment, the gentle caress of a breeze against his cheek, or whether his feelings had been locked up inside him, pressed against his heart since his first moments of clarity. Chuuya could accept Yokohama into him completely and without regret. He turned to Yuan. She was sat beside him in the muddied alley, her voice little more than a breath of wind against the bustling crowds by the port. I don't want to be a hero, he said. He was a little confused. The sheep were important, he felt, and were fighting on the side of justice. But he had never once considered them heroes. But aren't we kind of like heroes? Yuan shifted a little. She brushed pink strands away from her eyes. Her hair was growing longer as each day passed. The sleeves of her bomber jacket were fraying beneath fiddling fingers. She was ashamed, he thought, or maybe even guilty. We protect the innocent, and we deliver justice to evil. Yuan dash. I know we shouldn't really say it out loud. But can't you admit it just for a second? Aren't we kind of like the heroes of Yokohama? Chuuya felt his body stiffen, each muscle pulled taut. Stretched and torn only in order to become stronger. He saw Yuan's expectant gaze on him. Her friend, her leader. I guess we kind of are. Her beam was radiant, and so impossibly worth it. For a split second, maybe two, Chuuya let himself wonder. Let himself dream of what kind of life he could have led. Dream of the people he could have saved. Of the way that his fans would have looked at him, adoring and humbled. Now, people only looked at him with disgust when he was just another street kid in Yokohama, or fear, when he was king of the sheep, the fearsome vigilante group. Vivid blue eyes came to him in his memory. Eyes that looked at him with warmth and benevolence. You're already a hero, my boy. And no quirk, no scar, no god can change that. What makes you a hero is your actions, it's you alone. For once, the memory didn't hurt him. Didn't feel like the scrambling and clawing of a long-dead corpse clambering out of its coffin. It felt like the compassion of a truly good man. For only the second time, Nakahara Chuuya wished he could become a hero. Dazai Osamu and the Two Strangers, Part 1. UA was large. Large enough to host a school full of aggressive teenagers. Large enough to house multiple gyms, arenas, and even some dorm rooms, Dazai had been told. Not to mention the crocodile pool that he had been actively avoiding. But more relevantly, large enough to get lost in, if one didn't know their way around. Dazai found that out the hard way. When one's sadistic form teacher makes one skip out on the initiation assembly for a quirk apprehension test of shifty legitimacy at best, one does not know their way around. And one does get lost. The bell had rung only a few minutes ago, signaling the end of the day. The unavoidable beginner's nerves had begun to wear off of Class 1A, and were slowly but surely being replaced by the general distress that came with school life. The waking up at 7 and choking down breakfast. The dreaming through maths lessons and thinking of inventive new excuses for lacking homework. Dazai had realized that, in amongst the flurry of first-term activity, he had quite simply failed to explore UA. He was a spy, a plant, an informant, for goodness sake. So why was he the holder of so little information? He had been, devastatingly, forced to ask Atsushi for directions to the teacher's lounge the other day. Atsushi. Worse, the boy had actually provided him with an answer. Dazai had watched Atsushi walk into a pole and then look around for what hit him. He wasn't exactly the most clued-up kid in the world. So there Dazai was traipsing through the halls of UA in a good-natured attempt to get to grips with the layout. 5 random turns later and he was lost. It was a nice corridor, at least. Or so Dazai told himself, perhaps in a pitiful attempt to placate his bruised ego. Beige carpeted floors spanned the area, soft and newly laid. Dark blue walls were disrupted by door upon door. Checking the signs, Dazai figured that he was in the general education building. How incredibly exciting! Strolling down the halls, Dazai resigned himself to a life of wandering. A stray student or teacher passed him occasionally, but no one that he felt the desire to bother. Class 3A, 3B, 3C, U3F. How novel, Dazai recounted. Class 2A, 2B, he chirped, before a sign caught his eye. Printed in bold black characters. The library, he hummed. In a rare moment of optimism, Dazai decided that the library could be interesting. It did, after all, contain fountains of knowledge. Word after word building lives and spirits that didn't exist in this realm. And more importantly, it may even contain the most wonderful book of all, the complete guide to suicide. Oh, what a miracle that would be! So in he pranced, allowing the door to slam loudly behind him because he couldn't care less about anyone else's peaceful reading experience. The first thing that Dazai noticed about the UA library was that it was just as majestic as the rest of the school. Or maybe a more appropriate term would be imposing. Shelves of books lined every wall, their spines on display in a maze of mahogany cabinets. A glistening, spiral staircase twisted up through the center of the room, almost otherworldly in appearance. There were a few other students dotted about the area. Some had books in hand, others were hovering quietly over scribbled worksheets. They had largely ignored his entrance, with one notable exception. A boy was glaring at him, wearily. He was dressed in a neat rendition of the school uniform, his tie knotted more tightly than Dazai's had ever been. Glasses perched on his nose, lips were downturned beneath an elegant mole. Dazai waved his fingers cheerily. The boy did not respond. Genres labeled the start of each section of cupboards and shelves in the same orderly manner that the boy's tie had been arranged. He must have been the student librarian, Dazai's mind supplied. Although he had enjoyed his brief stint to the unknown halls of UA, he was rapidly running out of reasons to be there. Simply appreciating the wealth of reading material on display couldn't keep him entertained for long. And there was quite a variety from pre-quirk science fiction to the newest bestsellers. Not to mention the non-fiction section. He was considering making his exit, probably a welcome idea for the student librarian, when his gaze lingered on a single aisle. The sign above it held a combination of words that tapped at something in Dazai's mind like a repetitive beat in an annoyingly catchy tune. Quirk biology. Of course, quirk physics and chemistry existed as well, both very interesting in their own right. Neither were what he needed though, as he considered what had drawn him to the aisle in the first place. A simple question, what was Dazai Osamu doing at UA? A simple answer, spying. Most likely on the actions of the pro-heroes that constituted the teaching staff, one of which was All Might himself. A simple question, what was Midoriya Izuku doing at UA? A far more complicated answer. Surely, his almost complete inability to use his quirk would have hindered his chances at acceptance? Whether he had somehow battled through the entrance exam, or other forces were at play, his admittance to UA just didn't sit right with Dazai. His newest revelation only supported this fact. Midoriya's quirk held a strong resemblance to All Might's. In fact, a part of Dazai was convinced that it was the very same quirk. He had pondered for a little while over whether this could be coincidental, but concatenating all the facts, as well as the rare nature of such limitless superstrength, could only lead to one conclusion. Midoriya and All Might were linked in some way. As the issue concerned the number one hero, Dazai had decided it was well within his jurisdiction to look into what exactly was going on. And what better place to research such a thing than the library? He sauntered down the quirk biology aisle, eyes scanning titles and filtering out what wouldn't be useful to him. He had gathered a pile of 5 books by the time he came round to choosing a seat. A nearby table was surrounded by several chairs. Each was crafted from a beautiful, dark wood, intricate patterns carved up the sides. Deep grooves added texture, and Dazai found himself marveling at the work. Only one of these seats were occupied, a boy with his head bent over a thick hardback. He seemed unbothered by Dazai's presence, so he determined that there could be a quiet, mutual tolerance between them. Slipping into the chair furthest away from his new research companion, Dazai spread his selected books across the table. 2 of them were merely introductory books on the topic thin and lacking in the detail he desired. He had only chosen them for reference in case a topic he was unfamiliar with appeared elsewhere. He shoved them to the side, confident in his base knowledge of the subject. The 3rd book in his pile had initially looked promising, but the first chapter quickly dispelled any such feeling. It seemed to be more interested in comparing pre- and post-quirk cell structures than anything else. Dazai did not have time to relearn the definition of the mitochondria. Thank you very much. 4th in his spread was a heavy, leather-bound book. Quirks and Where They Come From. Written by Dr. Natsume Tobio, edited by Dr. Shigaraki Yoichi. Dazai peered over the table of contents, letting loose, brown curls form shadows on the page. He drew his finger down the list before finding a chapter of relevance. Page 243. Genetic Inheritance of Quirks. It is common knowledge, in the field of quirk biology, that quirks are more often than not passed from parent to child through genetic inheritance. Simply taking a look around you, or even considering your own ability, should prove this fact. A mother with a transformation quirk that leaves her with the physical features of an eagle would not be unreasonable to expect a transformation quirk of a similar nature in her son or daughter. Naturally, other factors such as the quirks of the father and remaining relatives will complicate this process. Additionally, genetic mutations could upset the straightforward transference of quirk from parent to child. Even environmental factors, including the mother taking excessive drugs or alcohol during pregnancy, could cause extreme changes to the nature of the inherited quirk. The chapter largely continued in a similar fashion, stating information that Dazai had picked up long ago. He was considering simply moving on when a footnote tucked away at the bottom of the page piqued his interest. Note that this evidence only applies to the inheritance of a quirk through the method of mitosis following sexual intercourse. It does not pertain to the inheritance of a quirk via asexual reproduction or transference. For more on this, please refer to The Changing of Hands, a study on unnatural quirk development. As much as Dazai hated blatant self-advertisement, the book seemed to be exactly what he was searching for. The transference of a quirk via methods other than genetic inheritance. It was taboo, deemed impossible by Philistines. And yet, other than the fact that it had never yet been achieved, there was no scientific evidence against it. Grinning, Dazai picked up the 5th and final book in his pile. Of course, it could only be one thing. The Changing of Hands, a study on unnatural quirk development. By Dr. Shigaraki Yoichi. It was this Shigaraki Yoichi guy again. He seemed to be quite the authority of the quirk biology field. Or at least, he had been when the book was published just over 30 years ago. Maybe he still was. The field of quirk biology hadn't progressed much since its original boom, just after the first wave of quirks swept through the nation. Skimming through the book, a couple of different concepts caught his eye. The mechanisms of quirk inheritance, which precise bases in a double helix of DNA were attributed to the characteristics of each quirk. A summation of the parts came as a mere detail in the final chapter. Recently, a popular thought experiment has emerged in the world of quirk biology. This experiment was originally conceived by a doctor and researcher who writes under the alias of S.T. It aims to test the hypothesis of whether a quirk can be transferred between one person and another via the ingestion of a quirk holder's DNA. Preliminary research has been performed and shows certain limitations that need to be taken into account before the experiment is conducted by Drive S.T in union with the University of Tokyo in December next year. The first relates to the DNA consumed, an exact combination of bases, which after being configured into amino acids, form genes, must be ingested to provide the body with the foundations, discussed in Chapter 8, necessary for a quirk. This would involve careful and precise extraction of the DNA from its source, as to ensure the requirement is met. Another aspect that will need to be carefully vetted is the quirk in question being transferred. The quirk transference experiment will benefit from use of a low-power quirk, initially. The effects that quirks have on the body are akin to the effects that water might have on a cup. The more powerful and plentiful a quirk, the more it fills up the body. Different people can be viewed as cups of different volumes that can hold more or less power. Pouring a lot of water into a small cup would cause it to overflow. This could be fatal. Equally, pouring any water into a cup that is already nearly filled would cause it to overflow, leading to the same result. This concept also creates parameters for the person the quirk is being transferred to. That is, they must be quirkless. One should not ignore the countless dangers and perils of such an experiment either. Dazai closed the book. He had learnt what he needed to. Next to explore was clearly the QD, led by Dr. St. Something in his gut twisted as he approached the mass of books again. The sky outside had gradually darkened, and now only the golden of the ceiling lamps illuminated laminated covers. He dragged a finger along the spines, watching specks of dust gently dislodge themselves as he did. It all felt like it was coming to a head. The so-called quirk transference experiment and the introduction of the mysterious Dr. St. What was most chilling was that Dazai had never heard of it. Either the experiment had been an anticlimactic failure, or it had all been brushed under the rug in a purposeful silence. The thought of the latter being the case felt like a terrible omen. Dazai could barely stop the smile that laced through reddened lips. Ryohei, Ryuichi? And there, right where S.T should have been scrawled, a cavity. A black hole in the shelf. Nothing. A nothing that was of a slightly boxy negative shape. A hardback that was completely free of dust, Dazai noticed as he swept a finger along the shelf. Freshly taken out. Dazai whipped around. The boy from earlier was still there, book on the table as Dazai had left him. A book that had just become infinitely more relevant to his life. Hello. The boy looked up, reddish hair shifting back into place and mouth a neutral line. Hello. Dazai rounded the table. If I told you that All Might himself has requested that I find that exact book, he pointed at the boy's hardback, and deliver it to him before the clock strikes midnight, would you give it to me? The boy looked thoughtful for a second. Yes, I would give it to you. That wasn't what Dazai had expected. He tilted his head, lips forming unbidden words. Why? Well, the small possibility that you're telling the truth is one thing to consider. But assuming that you're not, you probably just need the book. I'm pretty much done with it, so you can have it. Interesting. Pulling out the chair beside the boy, Dazai settled himself in. The stranger was attractive, yes, but appeared unremarkable. Dazai thought himself a good judge of character, though, and wasn't ready to let up just yet. Dazai Osamu, Hero Course Class 1A. Pleased to make your acquaintance? He offered a hand. Oda Sakunosuk, General Studies Class 3C. Yours as well? He shook it. How was the book, Odasaku? Would you recommend it to an avid reader of Shigaraki Yoichi like myself? Dazai swung his legs under the table. Oda, to his credit, didn't even flinch at the nickname. Instead he nodded slowly, as if absorbing the information. It's very informative, Oda eventually replied. But I'm wondering how anyone could be an avid reader of Shigaraki. He was an editor in his youth, yes, but as an author, he only ever published one book before his death. Dazai let his eyebrows furrow. How did he die? Illness, Oda shrugged. The diagnosis was vague. Dazai nodded. That's a bit of a downer. Tell me about yourself. Again, Oda complied without much reluctance. He didn't seem like a pushover as such, just someone who was happy to exist in tandem with the flow of life. It's laughable how rare those kinds of people are. Laughable how many of us choose to push against the current, draining our own life force, rather than simply swim with it. I'm hoping to take quirk biology into university, so I'm researching for my personal statement. And I really like curry. Dazai laughed, surprised. You moved on so quickly there. But maybe that's a good thing, he pondered. I like quick-witted men. Made a nice change from all the other men in his life. Then I don't know how much you'll like me. Rather than quick-witted, I just prefer to fully explain my thought process instead of filtering things out. That's very wise, Dazai replied. He took a moment, then a moment of silence. Oda didn't try to break it, which Dazai was thankful for. Some voids should be left unfilled. Dazai was facing something of a conundrum, you see. Oda had unknowingly presented him with a piece of information that could change the sequence of events that followed astronomically. Words and images were joining together, forming a chain linked by the bonds of deduction. If the story at the end of the chain looked anything like what Dazai was beginning to suspect, then digging could be dangerous. Dangerous for himself, and for anyone else who got tangled up in this mess. He briefly wondered if it was best to quit while he was ahead. But really, Dazai wasn't sure why he'd bothered to question himself. There was only ever one option. Odasuku, he began, voice light. The cutie. It was performed by Drivis.T, right? Oda nodded in confirmation. In conjunction with the University of Tokyo? This time he hesitated. I've read up to chapter 16, and there's been no mention of the University of Tokyo. Okay, that covered up a discolored patch in Dazai's theory. There was still no clarity, but there was a semblance of possibility. He inhaled. And it failed, right? The cutie failed. This time, there was no pause. The QT succeeded. Dazai felt the blood drain from his face. He could taste copper on his lips, metallic and tempting. Oda was staring at him, eyes questioning. Dazai ignored him. Because fuck. Dazai's theory was still scrambled and muddled, even in his own head, but it provided a basis for something of a scale far larger than he could have ever anticipated. Far larger, he presumed, than even Mori had anticipated. A dry cough sounded behind him, suddenly. Dazai wiped his face blank in a way that he had grown adept at. Then he turned around. It was the student librarian, wearing an expression that distinctly implied you again from someone who was too professional to say it out loud. Dazai grinned at him, pushing down the wavering edges of whatever this was, letting them lie dormant beneath the surface. Student librarian turned to Oda. Oda-san, he greeted tersely. Sakaguchi-kun, Oda replied. The library is closing. Please leave the premises. Aren't you going to introduce us, Odasuku? Sakaguchi looked about ready to go off himself. Which, could have been a fun bonding activity. This is Sakaguchi Ango from the second-year business course. And Sakaguchi-kun, this is Dazai Osamu from the first-year hero course. Nice to meet you, Ango-kun. I'm sure we'll get along great. Ango did not look like he returned the sentiment, but bowed anyway. He was scanning Dazai up and down in a way that he had probably intended to be vaguely threatening. I'm sure we will. Now can you please leave the library? So, Dazai hopped onto the table. How did you two meet? Ango groaned, but to Dazai's pleasant surprise, Oda laughed. I frequent the library, and Sakaguchi-kun has been the student librarian here since his first year. Dazai nodded. When I initially joined, I was desperately trying to convince Oda-san to join the library staff, Ango reminisced, shaking his head. Now I know that it wouldn't fit his personality at all, but at the time, I just wanted anyone else even slightly capable around. Beaming, Dazai interjected. If you're still looking for help, I could dash. No. Ango all but yelled. Oh. That will not be necessary, thank you. Dazai genuinely considered pulling the no shouting in the library card, but decided against it. He had, after all, already broken the majority of library rules himself. I understand, Ango-kun. You don't want to burden an important hero student like myself with your silly, menial tasks. Ango's voice immediately soured. It's nice to see an important hero student be so upfront about their massive ego rather than pretending to be well-adjusted like the rest of us. Oda looked a little pained as he watched on. But Dazai didn't stop. If there was one loose fray in this whole, tangled mess that he could weave back into place, he damn well would. You're only half right, Ango-kun. Yes, I am important, but not because I'm a hero student. Ango sighed, humoring him. Why then? There's an old man who sells tofu on the corner of the Memorial Park. Have you ever seen him? He's hard to miss. The tofu is huge. Dazai mimed the shape in the air, drawing a rectangle of only slightly exaggerated size. I've passed by him, I think. Oda nodded in recognition. Never seen him, Ango interrupted, curtly, looking unimpressed by the diversion. Well, I buy his tofu every morning. No one else ever does. I'm the sole customer that keeps his store running. Doesn't that make me important? Ango looked somewhere between entirely incredulous and somewhat interested. Oda was listening intently. What do you do with that much tofu? Oda asked. Dazai thought, briefly, of the time he'd hidden the tofu in Chuuya's school bag. Then of the time he'd hidden the tofu under Chuuya's pillow. Then, finally, of the time he'd replaced Chuuya's toothpaste with blended tofu. He shrugged. A variety of things. Oda nodded, seemingly convinced. Then Ango sighed. A half-smile pulled at his lips. I like tofu. The three ended up parting ways a little later. Dazai had checked the book out of the library, and it remained in his grip as he trudged home. When he reached the apartment, Dazai slumped down on the sofa. He dropped the book onto the coffee table, listening to its thunk resound around the room. Hey, asshole, we're not even a month into living here. At least leave it a couple of days before you fuck up all the furnishings. Chuuya swung through the doorframe to the living room, but stopped short. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Just that there was a tension in the air that had lit every one of his nerves on fire. Dazai was smiling. Really, genuinely smiling. Chuuya, I think I'm out of my depth. Megahara Chuuya and the attack on the USJ. Chuuya had seen a lot of smiles grace the lips of Dazai Osamu. One was a fake brand of charming, plastic and jagged. One was superior, internally laughing at you. One was reserved for when he was being a complete asshole for no reason. Not to mention, of course, the one he pulled out from time to time, when he was acting like a decent human being rather than an unstable hazard to society. This smile was different. It was new. And it was happy. Dazai looked truly happy, and it scared Chuuya like nothing else in the world. When he had first asked Dazai what had convinced him to join the port mafia, the answer he received had sounded ridiculous. But as he got to know Dazai, he had found himself beginning to actually believe it. I want to be exposed to danger and death. To people living out their darkest desires. I think that's the only way that I can ever feel alive. That smile, and those words, Dazai was never out of his depth, had never been. Chuuya could only imagine one meaning behind them. Dazai had finally attained it. Attained the gruesome, untainted evil that he had so desperately been searching for. And it terrified Chuuya to no end. His distraction had continued into the next day, as Class 1A were loaded onto a bus for some surprise field trip. Ida was directing them like he was made for the job. He had become class representative at some point while Chuuya wasn't listening. Good on him. Glancing over at Dazai, Chuuya wasn't too put off to see him acting completely normally. It was just like Dazai to maintain his facade as the world tore apart at the seams. Entering the USJ took his mind off the situation, at least. A vast arena spanned about before him, displaying a contradictory amalgamation of environments that Chuuya could identify at a glance. These included but were not limited to a flood zone, a cityscape, and even what appeared to be the site of a volcanic eruption in the distance. A high, glass ceiling held all of these mismatched parts together. Triangular tiles tessellated to form an encompassing dome around the whole arena. Imagine having this much money and using it to build a disaster zone replica for a bunch of 3-year-olds. UA could have had, like, 7 more crocodile pools by now. At some point, Dazai had wormed his way through the crowd to reach Chuuya's side. He wore a smile, the asshole one, and was looking around in poorly masked awe. Forget crocodiles. UA could have bought up the entire population of whales in the Atlantic Ocean. How many whales constitute the entire population of whales in the Atlantic Ocean? Chuuya considered it. At least 3. Dazai nudged his side, gently, stifling a laugh. He diverted his eyes. From his other side, Kirishima looked slightly miffed. More than 3, dude. Way more than 3. It was around then that the space hero, 13, made their appearance. They started off with a short speech on using their powers for good rather than evil, saving people rather than hurting them, and all the rest. Chuuya could only really focus on how much he liked 13's costume. It looked really warm and comfortable, unlike the skin-tight ensembles most heroes went for. He wasn't even going to begin to comment on Midnight's fashion choices. That was when a low noise began. Barely audible at first, but growing from a distant rumble into a sizable annoyance. Then a bang on the door. 13 turned to observe, slowly, too slowly. Because suddenly, it was slammed open. People began pouring in, wielding weapons with smooth, trained movements. Villains, a corner of Chuuya's mind supplied. He felt alert and sharp, watching as his classmates also began to notice the rapidly worsening situation. Fuck, he heard Eraserhead or Aizawa Sensei's curse from the front. 13, protect the kids, he yelled, already leaping into action. Eraserhead's fighting style was quite something, Chuuya could admit. The way he weaved and twirled around his capture weapon was almost like a dance. He was absolutely destroying every thug he faced, knocking them down like they were bowling pins. Your teacher is impressive, but one man alone cannot save you. Chuuya turned around with a jolt. A deep, resonant voice had sounded from behind the group. It belonged to a man that could only be described as pure evil. His entire body seemed to be a black hole. Ebony mist floated where a head should be, disrupted only by glowing, yellow eyes. His appearance contrasted rather starkly with his suit and waistcoat ensemble, and Chuuya assumed that his strange consistency was a side effect of his quirk. Good thing he's not alone. That was 13, stepping in between the villain and the students. Talking of his class, they appeared to be shaky but determined, each of them assuming the amateurish defensive positions they had only just begun to nurture. Step aside, Space Hero. Where is All Might? All Might? What did some low-level thugs want with the nation's #1 hero? Did they genuinely believe they could one-up him? Chuuya stilled when he felt a breath of air against his ear. A wisp of Dazai's distinctive brown locks brushed against his cheek. Stand by for Operation Touch Me Love Me. That sounded incriminating, but it was really just the code name of one of Dazai's plans of attack. It was pretty ambiguous, but communicated a clear idea. Touch Me Love Me was reserved for when they were up against an enemy with a strong or unique quirk, and revolved around getting Dazai within touching distance in order to nullify and subdue them. Chuuya rolled his shoulders. Time to work. 13 and the foggy villain were engaged in combat when Chuuya turned back. The hero was holding their own well, and Chuuya wondered why Dazai thought they needed to intervene. Then it hit him. 13 was fighting with a class of 20-odd children behind them. That could be 20-odd hostages, if the misty guy played. The game in the way Dazai seemed to be expecting. Outstretching their arms, 13 looked ready to activate their quirk. A widening chasm took shape where their torso had been, already arbitrarily engulfing the plants and items that made up their surroundings. That was when Chuuya felt a movement beside him. A small shift, hardly noticeable. And then they were charging. Shit. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushed a wrist. But couldn't quite encircle it. Kirishima and Bakugo had brashly run at the villain, quirks at the ready. They had forced 13 to abruptly shut off their black hole with a panicked yelp to avoid inadvertently sucking them in. Chuuya sighed. They had played right into the hostage situation. The pair's disappearance into the smoking mass seemed to be something of a trigger for the villain. He started to fire off a volley of what Chuuya recognized as warp gates. He scrambled backwards as one flew towards him, only just avoiding it. Shouts filled the entranceway as more of his classmates vanished into the blackness. He didn't know where the gates went to, and he sure as hell didn't want to find out. He jumped and rolled, desperately avoiding the barrage of gates that flew at him. He couldn't keep this up, he needed a system, some way to tell where they would come from next. As it was, There was no way he would be able to avoid them all. Then, a ginger strand flew through his vision, just before another warp gate almost consumed him entirely, and he knew he had found his method. The rushing black gates displaced air particles, creating a wind of warning just before they hit. His hair floated upwards, and Chuuya leapt into the air. The warp gate passed under him safely, and he grinned, toothily. The bombardment only continued for another minute before the black fog began to clear. Surveying the area, Chuuya immediately noticed Eraserhead, still holding his own impressively against the endless stream of villains sent to fight him. Bodies littered the marble floors of the plaza. Around him, only a few figures remained. 13, panting slightly, as well as the villain himself, still blocking the door. Dazai was standing only a few meters away beside a heaving Atsushi. Ida wore gritted teeth and a look of anxiety nearby. Staring them down, the villain nodded his head slowly. Perhaps I should introduce myself, seeing as you all plan on sticking around. He swept an arm towards them all. My name is Kurojiri, and I am part of the League of Villains Dash. He was interrupted by something that sounded distinctly like laughter. What is it? He snapped. Sorry. Chuuya knew that voice. He was tempted to punch Dazai in the stomach to shut him up for a while. It's just not a very creative name. Don't let me stop you though. Kurojiri blatantly ignored the comment, and continued his tirade. But a slight rustle of movement caught Chuuya's eye, and suddenly Dazai's offhanded comment made sense. Slightly further back, 13 was whispering to Atsushi and Ida. They gestured towards a tile in the glass dome. A tile that, as Chuuya squinted at it, appeared to reflect light in a different way to its counterparts. It must have been made of glass of a different density. Thinner glass that would crack at the slightest pressure. It was positioned at a low point in the dome, easily accessible, allowing for a bit of a jump. With a nod, the two boys slunk off into the undergrowth. He understood. If they escaped from the USJ, they could call for help. This whole ordeal would shift from a one-sided massacre into a waiting game. And if there was one thing that Chuuya had proved he was capable of doing, it was surviving. We are an organization dedicated to taking down All Might and turning this hero-infested society on its head. Atsushi and Ida were huddled together, motioning up at the ceiling. Atsushi transformed into his tiger form. This time, 13 spoke up. What makes you think that you can defeat All Might, the strongest hero Japan has ever seen? Kurojiri smiled. Or at least, it looked like a smile, the fog shifting in such a way. I suppose you'll have to find out. A crash exploded through the air. Shards of glass rained down as Atsushi leapt through the dome. His fur rapidly bloodied with thousands of tiny scratches, but he didn't stop. Ida joined him soon after, speeding through the hole, motors whirring. Kurojiri scowled but couldn't react. Because that was when 13 had decided to strike. Black hole! They screamed, opening their chasm for the second time. But it was all over in a flash. With only a look of slight inconvenience, Kurojiri shot a warp gate towards the hero. Realization flashed in 13's eyes. They rushed to shut their quirk off, but it was too late. The once mighty black hole had already consumed Kurojiri's flying warp gate, causing that powerful suction to teleport and exit at a second gate. A gate that Kurojiri had planted directly behind 13's back. Black hole tore through the mist, remorseless as it ripped apart its very holder. Destroyed by their own quirk. 13 fell heavily to the ground. A moment of absolute stillness followed after that. Chuuya felt his cheeks pale. It was one thing to watch his classmates be so easily disposed of, but for a pro hero to lose in the blink of an eye? The ground shifted under him. The infallible pro heroes were not quite as trustworthy as they seemed. This Kurojiri was not to be underestimated. Finally, Dazai groaned from beside him. Everyone has disappeared to some place or another, and the mighty Eraserhead over there, he motioned behind him, is a little preoccupied at the moment. Dazai trailed off, but Chuuya had already caught the drift. A familiar brand of exhilaration filled his veins. It's time we went all out? Kurojiri looked a little contemplative at that, but ultimately stood his ground. Children who know little of the world shouldn't overestimate themselves. Dazai rolled his neck beside him, looking remarkably relaxed. Age before beauty, he almost sung, gesturing for Chuuya to go ahead. Fuck off, he snarled, but didn't hesitate a moment afterwards. Tensing his calves, he activated his quirk and propelled himself off the unforgiving floorboards and through the air, weightless. He had always loved flying like this, found it the most gratifying component of his quirk. His hero suit only added to the experience. It was relatively aerodynamic, allowing him to be quick and agile in the sky. Plus, his cape rippling through the air must have been quite the sight. The sensation ended all too quickly though, and he was dropping down heavily, right in front of Kurogiri. A warp gate appeared between the two of them, suddenly, and he pulled back before darting around the side. He had to be careful even though Kurogiri's body looked solid enough. There was no way to tell if it was actually just more of the black fog that seemed to constitute his flesh and bones. Before another attack could come, Chuuya planted a hand on the floor, gravity curling around him, and maneuvered into an acrobatic roundhouse kick. Kurogiri stepped away, easily, but Chuuya continued his approach. He fueled his kicks with the intensity of gravity, constantly ensuring he aimed only for Kurogiri's torso. For his part, Kurogiri was an adept fighter. He dodged but didn't retaliate. The passive attitude worried Chuuya a little. Having escaped, his classmates would obviously be going for backup. Surely, the villains should be searching for a swift victory. Chuuya ran in, intent on throwing a jab. But just as he approached, Kurogiri rushed to meet him. He had initially been standing on the steps at the entranceway, so as he advanced, Chuuya's target, the torso, dropped lower and lower. Now, as he flew, the trajectory of his fist was heading not towards Kurogiri's body, but towards the void that engulfed his head. Acting quickly, Chuuya manipulated his own weight. He pulled himself down to the ground with all the force he could muster. He exhaled painfully, a choking sensation gripping his lungs, as his back cracked against the ground. He gritted his teeth against the sparks of discomfort burning in his lower spine. The wispy shadow of Kurogiri stretched over him, and light footsteps descended towards him. Panic began to prod at his skin like thousands of tiny pinpricks. A roar was growing louder under his flesh. The roar of a god locked behind iron bars. Chuuya clenched his fist harshly into the fabric of his suit, willing it away. No, he all but shouted. His voice only echoed around his mind as a whisper. Not you, please not you. Chuuya. A voice drifted through the haze. Melodic and familiar, and slightly out of breath. It was Dazai in front of him, suddenly. Through the crazed roaring and the nearing footsteps. He heard the next words with a beautiful lucidity. Touch me, love me. Eyes snapping open, he wasn't even sure when they had fluttered shut. Chuuya jerked himself up. Kurogiri was right above him. Dazai had been shoved into the unforgiving glass of the dome around them. A malevolent smile was shaping the cavity where a mouth should have been. But Chuuya was ready this time. Before the villain could react, he grabbed Kurogiri by the waistcoat. His fingers clenched around the fabric, gravity threading through them, strengthening him. Go! Dazai didn't need to be told twice. He charged forwards towards them as Kurogiri attempted to pull back. It was to no avail. Dazai had reached them in a second, and his hand was against the black mist that surrounded Kurogiri a moment later. A blue shimmer clouded Chuuya's vision, before it vanished into the air. As the ethereal remnants of no longer human gently dissipated like the melting of snow, three noises pealed through the first was a gasp. Short and breathy and right next to him. Chuuya turned to see Dazai, staring up at something with a look of unmasked astonishment. His arm was still pushed firmly against the dark fog, the same arm, Chuuya noticed absently, that had taken the brunt of an acid attack in their previous battle training. He hoped it didn't hurt too much. It took him a second or two to sort his thoughts into order. If Dazai was touching Kurogiri, then the villain's quirk had to have been nullified. That was a rule that was subject to no exceptions. And yet, the black mist remained. Kurogiri was still a monster of fog and cloud, and he was still smiling. The only possible conclusion struck Chuuya like a bullet. Kurogiri's shapeless form, that wasn't his quirk. That was him in his entirety. What they were dealing with, it wasn't human. Chuuya pressed a hand to his temple. It was throbbing painfully. His back was to... He didn't know what to do. Then came the second noise. It was a scream. High-pitched and piercing. It must have been a girl, a young girl. Chuuya whipped his head around to look, his neck objecting to the movement with an audible crack. Some of his classmates were gathered, hidden in the undergrowth around the plaza. The scream must have come from Tsuyu, the only girl in the group. But looking her up and down, she didn't seem to be injured at all. It was only when Chuuya took in the bigger picture that he understood the horrific scene playing out before him. Eraserhead, who had been so easily dispatching of villain after villain, was on the ground. Blood had pooled around him, dyeing his capture weapon a stomach turning red. Two figures were standing over him. One was a man with light blue hair and pale, disheveled skin. More noticeable, though, were the disfigured hands that gripped rigid limbs and covered any spare inch of space on his body like a grotesque fashion statement. They seemed to be attached to him, with one concealing his face like a mask, and were spotted with a discolored gray hue. The second, Chuuya wasn't sure quite how to describe it. It was simply a creature. Huge and strong, and standing over his teacher with the intent to kill. The third noise was the bang of doors against unyielding glass. There, at the top of the steps, were Atsushi and Ida. A smile rose to his lips, so thankful. Because behind the two, standing proud and tall, was a row of recognizable figures. And God, the indescribable joy that Chuuya felt at seeing them was not something he'd ever expected. But there they were, all might front and center. The pro-heroes. Akutagawa Ryunosuke on purpose. Hen, you've been dying all your life. It really gets you thinking about what exactly it is to be alive. What differentiates the two states? What sets those on Earth apart from those that came before them? Akutagawa would argue that such a divide is forged by the concept of purpose. Those on Earth, they have dreams and goals and desires. They dig through the soil with muddied fingers in a desperate attempt to find whatever treasure they're searching for. To hit on gold. The dead? They wander meaninglessly. They exist only to survive, and then simply wither away into nothingness. They are not remembered. They are not missed. And the things they do make no lasting impact. Produce no words on the records. Akutagawa was, by his own definition of the word, dead. And part of him hated it. Felt ashamed and pitiful, inflicting nothing on the world but his own built-up resentment. Committing petty crimes in order to what? Survive? Help his sister do the same? It all felt pointless. That was when Shigaraki Tamura had found him. And everything had changed. Majima Atsushi and the attack on the USJ. As it turned out, throwing his body into a panel of glass had been the easy bit. Thick shards rained down on him as he soared through his makeshift window. The jagged edges cut at the skin beneath striped fur, drawing blood. Even so, the scrapes healed almost immediately, closing up of their own accord. Ever since Atsushi had heeded Dazai's advice, considered the tiger an extension of himself, he had felt lighter, freer as the beast. His control was stronger than ever, and his regenerative ability had improved as well. When he reached the outside of the USJ, landing slightly clumsily, Atsushi paused. His fur was matted with blood, but the wounds were closing up where he crouched. Anyway, a couple of superficial skin injuries were the least of his worries. Atsushi thought back to his friends' faces when the villains had first poured in through the entrance. The fear. And then the determination. The willingness to fight for themselves and their allies. He resolved himself, transforming back into his original form, letting the beast inside him melt away. Meld with him once more. Then, Atsushi stood his ground, watching Ida steam through the hole he had created. The other boy looked a little winded, glasses knocked slightly off kilter after the misty villain's waves of attacks. Ultimately, though, he seemed to be unharmed. Atsushi felt a genuine smile curl at his lips. Every cloud had a silver lining, he supposed. Atsushi-kun, great work breaking through the dome, Ida said. Even in the dire situation, Ida's tone sounded sincere. A warmth bubbled up inside Atsushi at the words. He hadn't always lived in places that allowed him to receive such affirmations. Such praise. He felt endlessly grateful for the wonderful people that surrounded him here. Don't thank me just yet. We have to find the teachers and save everyone, Atsushi replied, unwaveringly. We need to go back to UA, Ida agreed. His motors were already raring, attention on the long road back to school. Why turn back when your opponent is right in front of you? Atsushi froze. The question had been posed by a gravelly voice, quiet in a way that demanded people listen to it. However, even as Atsushi surveyed the area, rotating slowly, he couldn't see a single person in the vicinity. He glanced back at Ida, ready to call out to him, but something in the line of Ida's jaw stopped him. His gaze was fixed on the dome of the USJ. More specifically, the apex. And right on the highest point of the glass ceiling, a figure stood, shadowy even in the direct glare of the sun. The silhouette was casually poised, comfortable and unafraid, even as the battle raged on below him. An elegant coat hung over his shoulders, dancing in the breeze. Locks of hair that should have framed his face were hovering out of place. The image of him against the sun, standing upon the whole world, held a certain beauty to it. A certain mortality. Ida-kun, Atsushi whispered, eyes never leaving this newfound threat. Go back to you. It was no secret that Ida had him beat on speed, even with the tiger's animalistic power. Though the aura that resonated from the man atop the dome sent shivers down his spine, he couldn't selfishly keep help from his friends by requesting Ida fight with him. Because that was clearly what the man was yearning for. A fight. It was clear in the shaking of his hands, restless, which wasn't quite covered up by the general movement of his clothes. It was clear in his eyes, wide with hatred. The kind of hatred that could simply overwhelm a person. Indifferent to whatever target it had once been aimed towards, or purpose it had served. God, Atsushi had seen enough people lose themselves to that kind of hatred. Will you be all right? Ida asked. He was frowning slightly, lips pinched. Atsushi inhaled. Last chance to back out. I'll be all right, he reassured Ida. And himself. The tiger will protect me. After a moment, Atsushi felt more than saw his companion nod, grimly. Then he shot down the road, leaving only footprints in his wake. As Atsushi had expected, the figure on the dome didn't move to follow Ida's retreating silhouette. He must have been affiliated with the villains attacking the USJ, Atsushi believed, but perhaps the link was weak. Rather than fighting for a cause, he seemed to be more interested in fighting purely for the sake of fighting. You must be confident in your abilities, sending away your ally like that, he sneered. I suppose I will soon discover whether that was bravery or stupidity. And with that he jumped. Soaring through the air, he landed gracefully on the cobbled ground below. At once, he readied himself to attack. Atsushi transformed immediately, the tiger enveloping him like a safety blanket. His fangs were bared when the enemy reached him, coat glowing with a burning red light. The fight was fast and strong and hard. It was intense in a way Atsushi's training could never have prepared him for. The boy, because he couldn't have been much older than Atsushi himself, was experienced, that much was clear. He manipulated his coat between clasping fingers as if it was his own limb, cutting with it when it became as sharp as a knife. Holding it out to take the brunt of Atsushi's attacks like an inbuilt shield. It was strange, his enemy had clearly possessed the upper hand since the very beginning. Atsushi was defending desperately, grasping at any chance he could to back away, steal a moment of reprieve. He had barely landed a single hit, whereas his own regenerative powers were being stretched to the limit. But for some reason, even arduous minutes later, the boy was simply unable to finish him off. Every time they reached some semblance of an ending, every time Atsushi found himself thinking this is it, he was able to escape the clutches of defeat. Maybe the final attack wasn't decisive enough, lacked finality. Or maybe Atsushi himself was the disruption, desperately clinging to life. Like a parasite to its host. Either way, the battle dragged on and on. His enemy was getting increasingly frustrated, that much was clear. His attacks were growing more reckless, slashing and stabbing rather than pulling back to defend. Aiming for the heart and the neck. Part of Atsushi's mind considered this an opportunity to launch a counterattack of his own. The other part considered it a nightmare. Considered it seconds until his worthless existence met a brutal but unavoidable end. That same part of Atsushi was a little shocked to realize that he couldn't accept that. He wouldn't allow that. One thing that Atsushi had noticed about his opponent was that he was completely silent. Other than his own heavy breathing and the rustling fabric of his coat, he moved with impossible stealth and said absolutely nothing. That was another way in which the fight was unlike his training, Atsushi mused. His instructor was always yelling insults or berating words during spars. The real thing was deadly silent. Not that Atsushi could have heard much over the constant ringing in his ears anyway. At some point, Atsushi fell into something of a lull. He had been fighting the boy for what seemed like hours, the passage of time had stretched and warped, and he was tired. It was all blocking, defending, leaping back only in order to lash out with his claws in vain. Realistically, it was a one-sided massacre. Atsushi could only wonder if the other had been keeping him going for so long just in order to toy with him, as some sort of sick joke or to prolong the violence he so clearly yearned for. He wondered briefly what it would take to end this match in any way, shape or form. He came to only one unyielding conclusion, and then he felt something shift within him. It was a strange sensation, largely because rather than originating from his own weary body, it had come straight from the tiger. Atsushi froze in his place, momentarily, as he strained his mind, trying to figure out what exactly this instinct was. It felt like caffeine rushing through his veins, erasing all the aches in his bones and the haze that had clouded over his head. Adrenaline. And then he was on his back. He had been still for a second too long, lost his grip on his surroundings. Now, even as he struggled and thrashed, that demonic coat kept him thoroughly pinned to the stony floor. He resigned himself to the villain eventually. That burst of energy had worn off like bursts of energy tend to do, and all the aches and pains that never quite disappeared, even after regeneration, pulled at twinging muscles once again. Apologizing was all he could do. Not to himself, but to the tiger. For letting them both down. Even after the tiger had granted him this gift, powered him on rather than shutting him down, taking over. It was shameful. And something about it felt wildly unfair, that he should die at the hands of this boy, even after everything he had survived. Orphanages and foster parents passing in a blur, simply too eager to get their hands on the tiger they thought was so marvelous. It had disgusted Atsushi. The tiger had. But when he finally discovered a new perspective, he should fall at the whims of a maniac. It just wasn't fair. When he had chosen this path, he had known. He had known that heroes could die too. He just never thought it would be quite so soon. He looked up then into the eyes of his captor. He expected to see that unrivaled look of anger again, before a cut through the heart or a slash of the neck. But he did not experience any of that, because the boy's eyes were no longer angry. It was as if any trace of resentment had been scrubbed clean, replaced by something else. Bewilderment. Fascination, maybe. His brows were furrowed, slightly, and his lips were twisted downwards in displeasure. Then he spoke for the first time since the beginning of his attack. "You're still a child?" A sigh. "Stand up, or tiger. Stand up and better yourself." Then the boy stood himself, removing the weights that had pressed Atsushi down into the earth. He stepped over him, like Atsushi was merely rubbish littering the street, and began making long strides towards the forest that surrounded the USJ. He didn't move an inch. Shock held his muscles firm. He had been one fatal slash away from the end. A low noise was coming from behind him. Voices and thumps on the earth. The boy was quickly disappearing into the bushes as Atsushi peered over at him. "We will meet again when the time is right," he said, voice low, before vanishing from sight completely. Relishing in the moment of stillness that overtook the world, Atsushi breathed out a sigh of relief. Why he hadn't been killed, or what those words had meant were questions for another time. For now, the sky was a gorgeous blue, and the pro-heroes were on their way. Todoroki Shudo and the attack on the USW Hen. The pro-heroes arrived, All Might leading the charge. A wave of relief swept over his body. Sure, Todoroki had beaten the army of thugs in the mountainous zone easily enough, but the difference in skill between them and their leaders was outlandish. Facing up against the man who called himself Shigaraki Tamura and the creature that they called Nomu was a death wish. The sight of his teacher leaking crimson on the ground only reinforced this. even as everything in him screamed to move, to help. He stayed where he was, hidden by the undergrowth around the plaza. "Do not worry, for I am here." Todoroki respected All Might like no one else in the world, but his unfaltering smile and untamable hairstyle seemed almost comedic given the situation. All Might existed through a screen. Perhaps that was part of his charm. He saved people and captured villains, everyone coming out unscathed from the other end, like they were in a pre-quirk action cartoon. But there his teacher was, dying on the floor, and suddenly, it was all very real. So real that even All Might couldn't wave his magic wand and fix everything. Todoroki watched as All Might extracted his classmates from harm's way and distracted the villains from his teacher. He watched as All Might faced up against the Nomu, his victory certain. Then he watched as All Might began to lose. It was slightly surreal, actually. The idea that this all-powerful, godlike force could be defeated. He watched as the other pro-heroes jumped in. As the villains fled through a swirling, back portal and All Might was obscured behind a cloud of smoke, Midoriya rushing towards him. And, noticed by no one, limping down the steps of the entranceway, he watched as two members of Class 1A emerged from battle. Dazai and Nakahara. Faces contorted in pain and laughter in equal measure as they approached the group, blending into chattering groups of students as if they had been there the whole time. Later, he would overhear them talking to the others, telling them they had been left stranded in the plaza, unable to help and regretful. Later, as the teachers briefed them in smooth tones, telling them it was a one-off attack, Aizawa-sensei was in hospital and recovering, they had a long weekend starting from tomorrow, he watched them. Shigaraki, huh? He heard Dazai mumble as the heroes recounted his name. He didn't know the what, the how, or even the why, but he knew that Dazai and Nakahara weren't normal hero students. They weren't trustworthy. And considering the recent villain attack, they were hostile. Nakahara, Chuuya, and the shopping trip. "See, Chuuya, what did you just say?" Chuuya looked up from his seat at the kitchen table. It was a bar stool, sleek and silver to match the rest of the decor. Dazai was leaning against the marble counter. After all, he wasn't allowed within a meter radius of the stove. For both the safety of the stove, Chuuya had grown very protective of it over the past month, and to avoid an untimely demise via being burnt alive. "I said, we need to buy scented candles," Chuuya repeated. "Before that, Nutella." Before that, confused, Chuuya sent Dazai a glance before returning his attention to the scribbled shopping list in front of him. That was when he understood. His head dropped to the table with a thud. Bandages. Dazai was beaming, and it was so terrible. It was their day off, perhaps the best consequence of the attack on the USJ, and they had decided that a shopping trip was in order. The Port Mafia Company card was still full to bursting after all, and Dazai simply couldn't allow that to continue. And maybe, just maybe, they were subtly trying to delay reporting the events of the USJ incident to Mori. Because that would surely be a painful conversation. Although Recovery Girl had done her best for Chuuya, her quirk couldn't reach every ache and pain. Bandages were a necessity for the both of them, he justified, and there was no shame in buying them. When he voiced his thoughts, Dazai laughed at him unabashedly. And yes, it was definitely at him, not with him. "When I buy bandages, I'm a freak and a bandage-wasting maniac. But of course, when you buy them, it's all very reasonable." Flipping him off, Chuuya slunk off to the doorway. He located his chunky, black boots. They were kind of like comfort blankets. Comfort shoes. "Look at me, I'm Chuuya and I'm allowed to buy bandages because I'm mentally stable and have superior brain function." Dazai was still speaking, for some reason voice lilting in a mocking imitation. He slid into his Gucci leather loafers, also on the Port Mafia Company card, before following Chuuya out the door. "Dazai, say another fucking word and I will destroy all of your One Direction posters." "You wouldn't touch Harry Styles," he replied, deadly serious. "Would you? Try me, bitch." It didn't take them long to reach the highway. Their apartment was situated in a nice area, a couple of minutes' walk from the road of busy shops and restaurants. Chuuya quite liked the neighborhood, lined with trees and greenery, full of characterful eccentricities. Chuuya liked to look in through the windows of each store as he passed by. It reminded him a little of his time with the sheep in Yokohama. They had talked, half mockingly, half wishfully, in that bitter way of theirs, about what they would do if they had all the money in the world. Somehow, Chuuya supposed that he had almost attained such a dream. He sighed, turning his attention back to the precarious display of paperbacks that rested in the window of a bookshop. The sheep were such a tangled mix of nostalgia and disappointment that Chuuya still didn't like to think back on them too much. All those books making you uncomfortable, Chuuya? Although he was absolutely as annoying as usual, Dazai had seemed a little more subdued since the USJ. Maybe the events of the week were weighing down on him. Why would the cat in the hat make me uncomfortable? Dazai faked shock. So you can read. Calming his annoyance with the longest exhale of his life, Chuuya increased his pace slightly. Unfortunately, Dazai had no issue keeping up. The long-legged bastard was growing taller by the second. All sorts of shops packed the street, including a pet shop, which Dazai practically squirmed away from, and an ice cream cellar, which Dazai very nearly escaped into. Chuuya's favorite was a quality menswear brand with a deep crimson exterior. A selection of mannequins posed in the window, clothed in velvet waistcoats and stylish top hats. He tried not to slow as he passed the shop, because God Dazai would bully him mercilessly for that, but clearly he didn't succeed. That one would look good on you. Then he really did stop. He stared at Dazai in open shock, but Dazai wasn't looking at him. He was intently focused on the clothes in the window, considering. What? The dark green waistcoat. The swirly one. It would suit you? Chuuya scoffed, his lips curling into an incredulous smile without any thought. Thank you. It's gorgeous. Dazai Osamu was someone who was hard to put your finger on. To ever completely pin down. Dazai shrugged, murmuring something under his breath, and they continued on. Later, they came to a stop outside of a music store. A colorful range of electric guitars were stood upright behind the glass, and several customers could be seen inspecting them. So we're going to divide and conquer. I'll take food, shopping, and toiletries. You're on, he grimaced, bandages and all the stupid shit you added to the list while I wasn't looking. What's stupid about tarot cards? I will not be answering that. Meet back here at 6. With an affirmative nod, they parted ways. Fulfilling his own role, Chuuya shopped quickly and efficiently. He was held up slightly at the conditioner aisle, because only the best for his hair, but managed to arrive back at the appointed location with 5 minutes to spare. Chuuya considered himself a patient person, and had no issue waiting for a while. The view was beautiful as the sky began to darken, winter sunset bathing the street in a golden light. And hundreds of people were still milling about, making for an enjoyable experience in people watching. By the time Chuuya felt inclined to check his phone, Dazai was already 10 minutes late. So he waited, and waited, and waited a bit more. Just as he was reaching breaking point, a familiar silhouette bounded towards him. Bags were dangling from both hands, and his hair was slightly windswept. At least he appeared to have made an effort to get back quickly. Sorry, Chuuya. I got distracted trying to pick a color for my lava lamp. Letting silence reign for a while, Chuuya massaged his temples. Which color did you pick? Orange. And that's so obviously the wrong choice. They were walking back, in comfortable silence, when Dazai next spoke up. Can we take a detour here? Go through the park. After a second, Chuuya nodded. It wasn't too out of the way. And it was peaceful out there. A welcome distraction from what had become a far more difficult mission that they had ever expected. Dazai led as they walked along pebbly paths. Lush grass stretched out before them, wild patches of flowers dotted around the otherwise empty field. It was quiet, no children or dogs there to make noise other than the hum of the wind as it disrupted the formations of leaves on trees. Chuuya realized as they walked that they were slowly heading towards a small booth. It was situated at one corner of the rectangular park, its pine enclosure perfectly in keeping with the surroundings. As they got closer, Chuuya could make out exactly what was being sold at the stall. He almost burst out laughing as he did. It was tofu. Huge fucking tofu. He reminisced, briefly, about all the weird and frankly ridiculous places that he had found chunks of the stuff over the past few weeks. At some point, his real anger had subsided and now he just shouted for the show of it. Because that was how Dazai and Chuuya were, and always had been. Give and take cat and mouse. Good afternoon, Mr. Watanabe, Dazai called, voice high and airy. A figure in the stall perked up, suddenly. He was an old man, wisps of a silver beard scratching at his chin. Wrinkles creased the corners of his eyes. From smiles, not frowns. Hello, Dazai-kun, he replied. Chuuya stood, awkwardly, as Dazai began browsing the selection. Not that browsing was really possible, all of the tofu looked exactly the same to Chuuya. I can't begin to imagine what a young person like you is doing with all this tofu, the old man laughed. He was bent over slightly, his back hunched and nodded. It's my friend over here who keeps requesting it, actually, Dazai began, a mischievous smile beginning to stretch his lips. Chuuya shook his head as subtly as he could, but the damage had been done. This is Chuuya? Mr. Watanabe waved, peering over the wooden beam that supported his stall. So it is. Hello, Chuuya-kun, he said. Good afternoon, sir. The old man laughed. He turned back to Dazai. Giving gifts to the people you love is the best use of all worldly currencies. I couldn't agree more, Dazai chirped. He sounded light and easy, but sincere. As sincere as he could be, anyway, when a lot of his personality was based on the illusions he created for himself. Chuuya felt his cheeks heat up a little. He looked away. Dazai and Mr. Watanabe chatted a little more about tofu size and firmness and whatnot. They were all exactly the fucking same, before coming to a satisfactory decision. They waved goodbye as they left the stall. Chuuya felt happy, somehow. Fulfilled. When they arrived home, Chuuya dropped the bags in the kitchen and scurried off to his bedroom. He was surprised to see a small package left just in front of the door. Brown tissue paper wrapped a compact, soft form. He picked it up, entering his room before beginning to tear at the wrapping. Shaking out the item, he could barely stifle his gasp. It was the green waistcoat, tailored and embroidered just as he remembered it. Chuuya was beaming. Class 1A and their teacher were attacked by the League of Villains in a failed attempt to detain All Might. The screen flashed with a call a moment later. Dazai and Chuuya were sitting on the lime sofa, the latter's phone resting on the coffee table. Nothing in the scene appeared to be amiss, but tension permeated the air. Chuuya accepted the call, switching it to speaker. Tell me everything. Mori's voice was a bit of a shock after going so long without hearing it. Endlessly smooth and authoritative. Chuuya couldn't help but obey. So he talked, step by step, through the whole event. From their first moments of awe inside the USJ, to their fight with Kurogiri. Dazai was able to use no longer human and, well, it was insane. Nothing happened. Either Kurogiri is immune to nullification, or the black mist isn't actually his quirk. It's literally part of him. Mori hummed on the other side of the phone, voice heavy with static. Then it took on a more menacing tone. And during this fight of yours, you didn't break cover? Instantly, Chuuya understood his boss's train of thought. It would be catastrophic if someone saw them fight on a level so far above that of normal first-year students, hero or otherwise. No one saw us, Chuuya replied as firmly as he could. The pause. Dazai-kun? Dazai was yet to say a word the entire phone call. But now, he sighed softly. No one saw us, he repeated. Then Chuuya described the aftermath. The pro-heroes appearing, with All Might saving the day and their battered teacher and classmates. How he fought Shigaraki Tamura and the genetically engineered Nomu. Kurogiri may well have been of the same stock, Chuuya pointed out. And with a wince, how Kurogiri had fled after Dazai had discovered his secret, and then re-emerged to warp what was left of the League of Villains away from the USJ. There was another villain too, likely affiliated with the League, but our information on him is practically negligible. All we know is his quirks, the ability to manipulate his coat at will, adding tensile strength and the like. Mori stayed silent for a second or two, as the pair held their breath on the couch. Then a voice sounded over the phone, crackling but still so in control. I owe the two of you an apology. I withheld information from you because I didn't think it would be relevant. It seems I have made a grave misjudgment of the situation. Dazai folded his arms over his chest. He didn't like that tone. And he didn't like the mind games that stemmed from beating around the bush. Your mission has two objectives. Number 1 is to gain information on All Might. A source has made it clear to us that his quirk, One for All, is not as simple as it seems to be. Voices in the underworld believe that it can be passed down from holder to holder at will. What? Chuuya felt his eyes widen at the news. He had never heard of such a possibility before. It was outlandish, practically unthinkable. He wrung his hands in his lap, nerves overtaking him. Your second objective relates to this. The League of Villains aim to capture All Might. The ground members of this organization likely believe in a larger, noble cause to do with the dismantling of the hero-based society. However, the creator of the League has an ulterior motive. A second of silence passed. They want to gain access to One for All. It was a guess, but it felt right on his tongue. It's a strong possibility and our current assumption. But we lack information on this creator, even their name is unknown. They're elusive at best. Dazai cut in, voice still serious in a way that Chuuya wasn't accustomed to. So what? Why should we get involved in the business between heroes and villains? You always say that Yokohama is a world away from that stuff. The sudden increased presence of the League of Villains and this creator, as it were, is causing a stir in the underworld. The police and heroes are tightening their control in cities, which is really only worsening the commotion. Chuuya nodded, convinced. Rather than this being a mission for the good of the port mafia, think of it as a fight for the freedom of all of Yokohama. Dazai laughed then, openly. Is there an issue, Dazai-kun? Moriet. A hint of annoyance clouded his tone. You're amongst friends here, you can be honest, Dazai practically sung. You just want All Might's power for yourself, don't you? His lips were still molded into the shape of a grin. No voice responded for a little while. Its silence was measured and careful. If you would like honesty from me, then such an outcome wouldn't be unwelcome. Dazai chuckled again, but his face was gradually darkening. Chuuya watched the spark fade from his eyes, and the solemn coldness return. He was reminded of his judgment from earlier. One could never really pin down Dazai Osamu. Thank you for your boundless honesty, Mori-san. With that being the case, I may well have some information that can help you. Dazai lowered his voice into a whisper. But it should probably remain, off the record. I'll send an operative in the area to meet you. Date and time will be forthcoming. Dazai clapped his hands, standing up from his position. Well, that sounds just wonderful. Now if you don't mind, Chuuya and I really are quite busy. Good night. He hung up. It seemed wrong to simply hang up on the boss of the port mafia, but Chuuya didn't comment on it. Dazai was obviously not in the mood for an argument. Mori Ogai and the attack on the USJ. See all the executives. The situation has changed. Mori Ogai drummed his fingers against the arm of his chair in a rare moment of solitude. He had sent Elise out in preparation for the meeting, and the messengers were long gone. A silence had enveloped the room, the first in a long time. But it was too loaded, too painful to be enjoyable. Like the silence before the shot of a bullet. The League of Villains were far more volatile than he could have expected. For once, Mori didn't know how this game was going to play itself out. It was exhilarating. Soon All Might. Soon I'll know it all. Dazai Osamu and the PM operative. It was satisfying in a way. To finally know. To finally see through the mist and the fog to the heart of the storm. To what Mori really wanted from this whole, doomed mission. Or at least, that's what Dazai told himself as he walked towards the meeting point Mori had set for him. 5 minutes late, naturally. The location was Table 7 at a Parisian-style cafe near his apartment called Wood Chip. Popular amongst the locals, Wood Chip predominantly provided its customers with coffee and fresh bakery items. Nestled on the corner of the highway, it shared a block with the local grocers and an art equipment supplier. Table 7 was a wooden outdoor set. A couple of white roses in a vase and a menu decorated the top, painting a quaint scene. Someone was already at the table when he approached, full, steaming mug in front of them. They were sitting, unmoving and patient, as their eyes wandered down the menu. Dazai's eyes lit up in recognition. Kyuka-chan. Long time no see, he said, sliding into the chair opposite her. It's been a while, Dazai-sen, Kyuka replied, stoic as ever. Chuuya was a 12-year-old girl who had been a trusted member of the port mafia ever since Mory's takeover. The boss liked her for a multitude of reasons. He had once confessed to Dazai. The power that Mori held over her quirk made her endlessly obedient, and so he never had to question where Chuuya's loyalties lay. She was quiet and serious by nature, so Mori didn't worry that she'd let important intel leak unintentionally. And apart from her general competence, Chuuya was young enough not to have developed a full understanding of the underground and the true meanings of the words that they all threw about. She was the perfect messenger, in that sense, for the movement of high-security information. Most of what was said was unintelligible to her. All she had to do was repeat it back later. "I didn't know you'd been sent over here. How are you liking the area?" "It's lovely," she said. Monotone as usual, but sincere. Dazai reached over to ruffle the top of her sleek, black hair. Chuuya took it without so much as a reaction. "I suppose we should get down to business?" Taking a sip of her drink, Chuuya nodded slightly. It must have tasted good, because a small smile pulled at the edges of her lips. She wiped it off quickly. "You have information regarding One for All," she stated. Honestly, Dazai was a little surprised that she had been told even that much. "I do," he confirmed. "Do you know anything about quirk biology, Chuuya-chan?" She hesitated before shaking her head. Fiddling with the buttons on his black coat, Dazai continued, leisurely. He really needed to get a more fashionable jacket at some point. Boiled down to its simplest form, people's quirks are gained from their parents through DNA and the process of genetic inheritance. Many top scientists in the field believe this is the only way that a quirk can be obtained. However, a research journal was published almost 30 years ago on an experiment that proves the opposite. Proves that quirks can be passed on via asexual methods such as the ingestion of a quirk holder's DNA in specific circumstances. This was called the quirk transference experiment. Glancing up at Chuuya, he was glad to see that she was still listening intently. The slight pinch to her eyebrows, however, suggested that she understood very little. But the less she knew, the safer. Dazai would easily wager his life on Mori's incredible, paranoia-fueled security. Not that Dazai wagering his life was so uncommon, and his own observational powers weren't too shabby either. He still had to actively repress the urge to scan the cafe for threats, though. It was all far too delicate for the dozens of eyes and ears around them. It was originally going to be conducted by researchers at the University of Tokyo, but they ended up bowing out. Rather than dropping it completely, the inventor, Drive S.T, completed it by themselves and wrote that the experiment was successful. You'd expect this big scientific news to cause some sort of a splash, but instead, it was swept under the rug and ignored like it had been some sort of shameful failure. The information was never released to the general public. Dazai held out a finger. That's the first strange thing. The second is the untimely death of another researcher in the area, Dr. Shigaraki Yoichi, in a similar time frame. I only mention this because of a possible connection to Shigaraki Tamura. Sighing, Dazai leant back in his seat. Such a lovely day, sunny but frosty for such dirty dealings. My current theory is something like this. All Might's quirk, One for All, works using the mechanisms tested in the QT. The Hero Commission didn't want this out in the open, so they limited access to the results. The creator of the League of Villains somehow gains knowledge of this, and wants to use it to bring down All Might for their lofty ideals. Shigaraki Tamura gets on board. Because of his connection to Yoichi, he has an interest in the matter. And here we are. Chuuya eyed him. You don't look convinced. There are too many holes, Chuuya-chan. I'm missing things. I'm sure of it, Dazai whined. He dropped his head into his hands. Mori-san is going to get such a kick when he hears Dazai-san. A voice cut through the general buzz of the cafe. He and Chuuya whipped towards it, and Dazai resisted the urge to buy a coffee and then spike it with arsenic before drinking. Good morning, Atsushi-kun. He tried for cheerful. Atsushi seemed to buy it, because he waved and started weaving through mismatched tables towards the pair. He was wearing a white shirt and jeans, holding a takeaway latte in his left hand. Dragging a chair from an empty table, he took a seat beside Dazai, admiring the view of the bustling highway opposite them. Hello. I'm Atsushi, a friend of Dazai-san's from school. What's your name? Kindly he smiled to Chuuya. She did not return the gesture, but Atsushi didn't look too put off. Sparing a confirmative glance for Dazai, she replied, evenly. Izumi Chuuya? She's my cousin, Dazai cut in. And like the wonderful cousin I am, I was just treating her to some delicious local cuisine at this fine, gastronomical establishment. Atsushi laughed. Have you shown her around the area yet? There's a mall down the road, and a cinema pretty close to here. Chuuya looked mortified at the prospect. He was about to decline the offer when Atsushi interrupted with a snap. Plus, the petting zoo that opened the other day? She looked as if the Holy Lord had smiled down on her. Then she looked as if she was wondering why a trained assassin was quite so excited by the mention of a petting zoo. Dazai grinned. You know what, that sounds fun. Chuuya looked at him, bewildered. But, she started, my dad is waiting for me. Your dad can wait a little longer. If he asks, say a small but pesky ginger rodent bit you, and we had to go to the hospital to check for rabies. Chuuya giggled. That actually giggled. Dazai felt pride fill him up like a hearty meal. She nodded, still reluctant, as Atsushi began to stand, looking perplexed but pleased. Wait, Atsushi-kun. You come too? Honestly, Dazai liked Chuuya. She was sweet and intelligent, and her work spoke for itself. He felt a sort of camaraderie towards her and the other kids of the mafia. The part of him that he sometimes felt he had little connection to, but that existed nonetheless. Dazai liked Chuuya. And he respected her. But he didn't know her. There was always an underlying current of tension in work conversations, and Dazai didn't want her growing up with no reprise from it. He himself had been wild enough to seek freedom from the confines of the mafia when he needed it. And Chuuya had only joined recently. Chuuya had none of that. Me. And if there was one person whose very presence put others at ease, who, for reasons that no one could quite explain, was able to peel away layers of tension and awkwardness from a conversation like they were oddly placed plasters, it was Atsushi. Yes, maybe his gaze showed a hint of his desperation, because Atsushi gave in without too much argument. To Dazai's surprise, it was Chuuya who spoke next. Do you think there'll be rabbits? As it turned out, there were, in fact, rabbits. Not to mention a family of hamsters, or maybe pigs. Dazai couldn't be sure, various wandering cats, an excitable group of dogs, several ferrets and a somewhat out-of-place snake. The petting zoo wasn't huge or particularly busy, and seemed quite impermanent. It was set up inside a large white tent that had been pitched on a field that the locals lovingly referred to as the green. Most of the customers were families with young children, but smiling hordes of teenagers also hung around, and a sweet elderly couple seemed to be enjoying the snake's antics immensely. Chuuya and Atsushi clicked well, racing from enclosure to spend time with each of the animals. Dazai found himself following from a short distance behind. He was focused on snapping pictures to spam Chuuya with. If only there had been some sheep at this zoo, it could have been marvelous. Instead, he settled for a shot of Atsushi being drowned under a wave of cats. They must have sensed the tiger in him, and Chuuya laughing at the side. He briefly considered sending it to Mori too. The boss hated to see people enjoying themselves, after all, but decided against it. He couldn't be sure exactly how Mori would react to it. Plus, the moment seemed quite pure, somehow. Quite sacred. Mori's eyes on the scene would deface it in a way. As time marched forwards and the sky darkened overhead, Dazai eventually decided that he couldn't reasonably extend their day any longer. Sending Chuuya back to Mori was an inevitable evil, and delaying it would not change that. She accepted it without argument when Dazai told the others that it was time to go, but disappointment twisted her features, clear as day. He and Atsushi allowed her off to circle by each animal once more before they left. She's a lovely kid, Atsushi said, conversationally. But something about his tone seemed a little off-kilter. And his eyes were glassy, as if he wasn't quite there. Something was on his mind. Trust me, I know. Now spill. Atsushi looked surprised at Dazai's forwardness, but gave in quickly with a self-deprecating smile. I met someone recently. Someone who's very angry at the world, I think. Atsushi stared out across the interior of the tent. Seeing all these animals in cages kind of reminded me of them, he murmured. Then his voice came out stronger, thick with resolve. I want to help them. For a moment, Dazai simply took in Atsushi's form. He was determined, and had steeled himself in a way that reminded Dazai of their first meeting. He was embarrassed to admit that in that instance, he was almost swept up by the other's innocent idealism. He almost wanted to close his eyes to years of experience and nod his head like the bright, young thing he was pretending to be. Instead, he placed a hand on Atsushi's shoulder. I've found in the past that when people are angry at the world, they're generally right to be. If this person is willing to be saved, then by all means, save them. Atsushi cocked his head. And if not, that anger is probably all they have left. You shouldn't try to take that away from them. Natahara Chuuya and the vigilante. Chuuya was someone who, by nature, was not often surprised. He had lived more different lives in more different places by 15 than most people ever found the time to. He had met so many people, heroes, villains and everything in between, and seen so many scenes play out. Both moments of wonderful kindness and atrocities that he could barely believe stained the records of history. But, yeah, the vigilante in the park surprised him. The clock had just ticked over to midnight when Chuuya rose. Something inside him was scratching, clawing and biting at the chains that kept it confined, a troglodytic kind of savagery about it. Dazai had long returned from his exploits at the petting zoo, happily scrolling through pictures of rabbits and hamsters, and Atsushi being buried alive in cats. Chuuya hadn't had the energy or will to stop him. The other had disappeared into his room at some point after that, as he had a tendency to do. Chuuya crept past on his way to the front door. He couldn't hear anything from inside. Dazai was probably asleep. He slipped on his boots and an almost mattress-like beige coat before unlocking the door, wincing at the clanging noises he couldn't seem to stifle. Before he knew it, his legs were guiding him towards the memorial park. It was tranquil in the night, silent and still. Lines of glowing lampposts took on the role of a sky of stars. Meandering paths etched patterns into the grass. Mr. Watanabe must have packed up for the night, because his usual stall was nowhere to be seen. Looking around one last time to ensure that he was truly, completely alone, Chuuya walked into the center of the park. The trees formed a sort of barrier between him and the quietened city around him. He closed his eyes, concentrated. For some reason that he had never truly figured out, Arahabaki became stronger on certain nights. Perhaps it was the passage of time gradually wearing on his control until he rebuilt it, like water eroding a dam. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Rather than question it, he had learnt to simply deal with it. Meditation was usually the way forwards. Silencing the mind and sharpening the senses. Forging and melding those chains once again. Link by link if he had to. The memorial park just seemed like an ideal place for it. Inhaling tightly, Chuuya searched within himself for where the monster resided. It was a deep, dark corner of somewhere quite unnameable, and Chuuya hadn't missed its cold air across his face. Arahabaki seemed aggressive, Chuuya thought, as he watched from the outside. Observed it like an animal in the petting zoo Dazai had been so adamantly keen on. It was worse than usual, though. That much was definitely true. More active, scraping at him as if in retaliation. Chuuya tried his best to seal it in. Repair the bonds. He really did. But he didn't think, as he grounded himself back on Earth, that he'd done a great job. He could still hear a snarl or a growl every now and then, if he listened really closely, coming from that undetectable prison. Opening his eyes, Chuuya checked the time on his phone. It had only been a few minutes since his arrival, but he felt utterly wiped out. More than ready to go home and sleep it off. A sudden noise behind him crushed that plan like a mere pipe dream. He acted without hesitation. Power surged through him, and he directed it towards a fallen branch, sitting amongst the undergrowth. Whipping around, he flung it at where the sound had come from. A figure darted away from the hurtling log, silhouette an inexplicable mesh of shapes, and into the circle of illumination of a nearby lamppost. Please calm down. I'm not a threat. Chuuya looked the man in front of him up and down. Chuuya was someone who, by nature, was not often surprised. He had lived more different lives in more different places by 15 than most people ever found the time to. He had met so many people, heroes, villains and everything in between, and seen so many scenes play out. Both moments of wonderful kindness and atrocities that he could barely believe stained the records of history. But, yeah, the vigilante in the park surprised him. It was Arthur Rimbaud. Arthur fucking Rimbaud. The eternally wintry ensemble of a gray trench coat and striped scarf. The river of hair paired with frankly iconic earmuffs. There was no doubt about it. And Chuuya was astonished. Arthur Rimbaud? The aforementioned slouched in relief, seeming to believe that any danger had dissipated. It's not often that people recognize me these days, he mused, tone a little brittle. Especially not young people. I haven't heard anything about you for years, Chuuya replied. He sounded earnest to his own ears, and sealed his lips in distaste. One might argue that's because I'm very good at my job, he shrugged. But really, it's because I'm getting older. Barely 10 years ago, Arthur Rimbaud had been the most active and capable vigilante in Tokyo. He had been skilled and just, daring to adventure where heroes never would, and challenging the tasks that others left to fester. Chuuya had been somewhat obsessed with him at a time, he was embarrassed to admit. It was an old but well-loved story amongst the sheep that Arthur Rimbaud had been their founder. Whether it was really true or not was another matter, but it hadn't seemed that important at the time. He was their icon. Their role model to act in the glorious name of. He remembered, briefly, hunching down over a library computer with Shigaraki, scrolling through blurry images. The first that had been in a high enough resolution to properly view was the one that stuck in his head most thoroughly. Arthur Rimbaud, perhaps a little more sprightly and youthful, but certainly the same man that was now in front of him. "What are you doing out here at night?" Arthur asked, moving towards him. He didn't sound accusatory, just curious. "I could ask you the same question." Arthur nodded, accepting the lack of an answer without follow-up. He reached Chuuya's side then, staring out to the city behind the trees with glazed eyes. "I've been detecting a strange presence in this area lately. I'm trying to figure out what it could be." Chuuya nodded. He was glad not to be the only one feeling on edge. It did register in his mind how strange the situation was. Here his childhood idol was, standing beside him and talking to him like they were old acquaintances. He wondered if he should ask whether Arthur had any connection to the sheep or if it was all just a myth. Shigaraki certainly would have been begging to know. He pushed the thought down. After all, the sheep just weren't his people anymore. Arthur plowed on, ignorant to his internal debate. "I'm worried that it could be related to the attack on those UA students the other day." He turned to Chuuya. "Have you heard about it? It's all over the news." "I've more than heard about it," Chuuya grumbled. A phantom pain traveled down his spine. Arthur sent him a look of immense understanding. The wind swept through his locks, then, blowing strands into the air with thousands of rustling leaves. "It pays to be careful," Arthur recounted, simply. He seemed lost in thought, after that. It felt like the end of the conversation. It probably was. But a part of Chuuya felt like he couldn't leave it at that. Couldn't let this opportunity slip. Couldn't lose the man that he had, in many ways, modeled so much of his life after. "Thank you," he said after a second. Arthur turned towards him. "Thank you for everything you've done. I could never really understand heroes, but I think that I can understand you." It didn't mean anything, really. It was just a sequence of words that Chuuya had chosen to explain something. Or create something. Or maybe to end something. But he felt good after saying them. Even Arahabaki seemed to have calmed inside him. "An odd predicament for a UA hero student," Arthur said, smiling. "I guess we can't really justify our deepest desires," Chuuya replied. The words tasted like honey on his lips. Fuller than he'd ever expected them to. Arthur left shortly after, leaping into the night. Parting from familiar footsteps, Chuuya turned on his heel and walked away. Dazai Osamu and the Two Strangers, Part 2. Mondi brought with it an undeniable underlying chaos. What with Eraserhead being wrapped head to toe in bandages, it felt like looking in the mirror, and the aftermath of the USJ incident on everyone's minds, classes were encompassed in a slightly frantic atmosphere. Then, the announcement of the swiftly oncoming sports festival only served to heighten tensions. Aizawa explained how the sports festival eventually led to hero internships, and encouraged them each to train hard. It was all very sudden. The sports festival, huh? Atsushi mumbled from his seat, leaning back dangerously close to the point of toppling. Only Dazai's own mismatched group of, friends and a couple of stragglers were left in the classroom at the beginning of lunch break. Midoriya was laughing as Atsushi dropped his head onto the table, defeated. "Aren't you looking forward to it?" he asked. "I want to show everyone what I can do." Midoriya's relentless optimism was both disgusting and admirable, but Dazai did have to admit to a slight curiosity about the whole event. "Same. Soon everyone will know that I can do very little indeed." With that, they filed out into the corridor. Dazai felt a gaze on his back as he did, but chose to ignore it. Todoroki Shudo, still at his desk in the classroom, was unreadable at the best of times. If he had chosen to stare at Dazai, there wasn't much that could be done until he came out with the reason himself or stopped entirely. "I'm super excited for it," Uraraka said. "It's an awesome chance to get our names out there amongst the big hero agencies. And it looks like so much fun on TV every year." Pushing his glasses further up his nose, Ida spoke from beside her. "Apologies for asking so brazenly, but I'm curious to know, Uraraka-san. Why exactly do you want to be a hero?" They were nearing the lunch hall, but the sudden inquisition stopped Uraraka in her tracks. She tugged at the sleeve of her jacket awkwardly as one by one, the others slowed in response. They looked back, questions written across their faces. "Of course, there is absolutely no obligation to answer if you don't wish to," Ida rushed to rectify himself. "No, I'm happy to answer." Appearing to steel herself, she took a deep breath and let a grin widen her mouth. "I want to be a hero for the money." A moment of silence. "The money?" A hint of uncertainty darkened Midoriya's tone. Honestly, Dazai applauded her for her answer. It was no secret that the top 100 or so heroes lived in comfort. That much could be proven by the luxurious and sprawling estates of heroes like Endeavor and Best Jeanist. Money seemed like as good a motivating factor as any. Maybe even better than the blatant flinging around of lofty ideals such as, "I want to help people," or "I want to pursue justice." Uraraka sighed, looking a little disappointed. "My parents own a construction company, but business has been slow recently, what with quirks like Cementos is about. We've really been struggling. I want to become a hero and make lots of money, so that I can support them and let them retire without worrying about the costs." When she finished, she sounded fully resolved and committed to her dream. As Dazai glanced around at the others, he found that to some extent, her resolve had spread to each of them. "That's actually," Atsushi began, "the best reason for becoming a hero that I've heard yet." Shocked by the reaction, Uraraka stared at him. A laugh sounded from somewhere within their group. "I couldn't agree more. To give back to one's family is a truly noble goal." They continued their approach to the cafeteria in high spirits. It lit a spark of hope in Dazai's heart to see that even the most hero-obsessed demographic in this society weren't complete hypocrites. The quiet tension that had been suffocating the class ever since the USJ incident was basically extinguished. It was when All Might came up to them, requesting that Midoriya join him for lunch, that Dazai felt a sting of curiosity run up his spine. Spinning out a half-baked excuse, he strolled after the two, trying to emulate his usual casual demeanor. They seemed to be heading towards the staff room, conversing in hushed tones that Dazai was unable to quite pick up on. Watching All Might and Midoriya walk side by side was actually quite laughable. The somewhat clashing combination of gold and green, as well as the stark, to say the least, contrast in height and bulk. They made a funny pair. The Midoriya is All Might's son theory that Dazai had taken a liking to was looking less and less reasonable as time went on. It was as All Might twisted the golden handle to the staff room that his cover was blown. It wasn't even his own fault, not really. Because there, in the middle of the corridor with eyes fixed on his own, was Sakaguchi Ango. "Dazai-kun?" Ango said, words ricocheting around the otherwise empty corridor noticeably. Dazai winced. Two pairs of eyes spun towards him. Green ones were lit in surprise, blue in something more akin to contemplation. He hurried to rectify the situation. "Ango-kun, what a completely planned and totally expected meeting this is." He willed Ango to play along. The other raised an eyebrow, but seemed to pick up on his unasked question. Indeed, he sighed. He shot an annoyed glance at Dazai before turned to All Might, bowing apologetically. I'm sorry for interrupting your conversation. Dazai-kun and I were planning to meet here, but I didn't notice him approaching, and was shocked to see him suddenly. Waving a hand, All Might smiled. His voice, however, sounded a little tight as he spoke. Not a problem, young man. Midoriya was looking at the hero, seeming almost concerned. You see, after I kindly allowed Dazai-kun to stay in the library after closing hours, and even check out a book, I was disappointed to find that it is now overdue. Dazai chanced a look at Ango. He had initially been lying, smoothly, through his teeth. This was truthful though. That sort of passive anger just couldn't be faked. In the future, young Dazai, please ensure that you respect the rules of the dash. All Might coughed into his hand, library. A true hero should not burden others with their own downfalls. Of course. Sorry, All Might, Dazai chirped, as All Might and Midoriya hurriedly disappeared into the staff room. Then it was just him and Ango. The latter was staring at the now firmly shut door to the staff room, concentrated. Dazai jogged over to him, whispering his next words into Ango's ear. New theory. All Might is illiterate. Did you hear how disgusted he sounded when he said the word library? Ango choked on air. Did you just accuse the number one hero of being illiterate? They began to walk down the hall, side by side, back in the direction that Ango seemed to have come from. Dazai wondered, briefly, where Ango had been going to. Only the staff offices and hero course classrooms were in this direction. He supposed that as Ango had just done him something of a favor, he wouldn't ask. Although he had only needed a favor because Ango had put him in an awkward situation to begin with. You don't become number one hero by reading books all day. You become number one hero by drinking a shit ton of protein shakes. Obviously, Ango deadpanned, shaking his head. They kept walking, and the gray walls of the hallways began to merge into a familiar dark blue. Where are we going? Dazai asked, although he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. Ango emphasized, am going to the library. Guess that makes two of us, Dazai replied cheerily. Entering the library for only the second time, Dazai followed Ango through the aisles. Perhaps surprisingly, Ango didn't comment on it, and instead continued in his weaving towards the front desk. By the way, is the book seriously overdue already? Yes. Please bring it back as soon as possible. But it's only been like 4 days. Ango turned to him, donning a slight smirk as he took a seat at his rolling chair. As the head student librarian, I decided that the borrowing system should be based on a meritocracy. He glanced Dazai up and down. I am yet to see your merit, so you don't get extended ownership of the goods. Gasping, Dazai plunked himself down on the wooden desk, very narrowly avoiding toppling the computer. That's just discrimination. Ango busied himself with the piles of books that had been left on various surfaces. He scanned each barcode carefully, and Dazai was briefly struck by the thought that Ango would make a very good full-time librarian. Can't you even read a book in 4 days? If not, you have even less merit than I thought. Dazai spluttered. I can. I just didn't think I'd have to. That was when a familiar voice drifted past the cabinets, deep and resonant. Sakaguchi-kun, do you know if the sequel I ordered has arrived yet? Appearing from behind a row of books, Oda stopped short at the sight of the pair in front of him. Dazai-kun, he said in way of greeting. Hi, Odasaku, Dazai replied. His smile was genuine, he found, as he watched Oda approach the desk. Even though they'd only met once before, Oda felt like an old friend. He supposed that feeling extended to Ango too, an acquired taste though he was. I heard about the USJ incident on the news. Are you all right? Dazai almost laughed in response. It wasn't often that people asked him something so simple. Something so off the bat with no ulterior motives. Oh, I'm great. When Oda's eyes strayed to the scrape across his cheekbone from a shard of shattered glass, he just shrugged. You should have seen the other guy. Oda nodded slowly, leaning against the sturdy cabinet beside him. Ango appeared slightly uncomfortable. He refused to meet Dazai's eyes, busily tapping at the computer keyboard. He had voiced his disdain towards hero students before, but Dazai felt that this time, It was Ango's inherent awkwardness that made him seem a little cold. He decided, mercifully, not to mention it. Forget the USJ. He sprawled out over the entire table, knocking a stack of books plain off. Ango protested loudly, and Dazai happily ignored him. The sports festival is what it's all about. If you want to talk about the sports festival, you've probably chosen the worst audience in the school, Ango said, wryly. Sounds like there's a story somewhere in there, Dazai prodded. Not really, Ango said. Your book hasn't arrived. Just yet, Oda-san, he added as a side thought. Come on. You can't just throw out such a cryptic statement and then pretend it never happened. Oda looked on from his spot, mildly amused. Ango scoffed in response. If you must know, I hate the sports festival. It's a stupid publicity stunt aimed at keeping the attention of the fickle pro heroes and the fickle sponsors that pour money into this school like it's worth nothing. Dazai whistled. Not to mention humiliating. I understand, to an extent, that this whole setup could debatably benefit the hero course pupils, but what about everyone else? Asking us normal students to run around like hooligans won't achieve anything except pissing us all off. Sakaguchi-kun doesn't like the sports festival, Oda supplied, helpfully. Honestly, Dazai could see his point. Especially this year, directly following the USJ incident, which could only have been the fault of UA's lacking security, the sports festival was closer to a publicity stunt than it had ever been before. A desperate attempt to gain back support and show that UA was not a school to be trifled with. His other argument was reasonable too. What exactly the general studies, business course, and in some cases, support equipment students gained from the sports festival was yet to be seen. More likely than not, they were there to make the hero students look good in comparison. Maybe occasionally one would excel and create a nice underdog narrative for the school to capitalize on. To some extent, it amazed Dazai that no one else was willing to pick UA up on these things. He felt a seed of respect blossom for Ango, then. Perhaps they were more alike than he had previously thought. And you, Odasaku? What do you think about this heartless, capitalist conspiracy? Ango mumbled something unintelligible under his breath, but had at least given up on his facade of working. Now his attention was clearly on the conversation at hand. I have no strong opinions on it, he said. Although I'd prefer not to have to fight, if possible. Dazai laughed. That was such an incredibly Oda response. Easy for you to say, Ango groaned. You could win the whole damn thing if you wanted to. Now that piqued Dazai's interest. He pulled himself into a sitting position from his slouch over the table. But even after scrutinizing him, Dazai couldn't detect a hint of sarcasm in Ango's words. It had just been a statement pure and simple. The fact. Dazai turned a pen he had found on the desk over between his fingers as he observed Oda's reaction. There wasn't much of one to observe, really. Just a slight shift in his stance and a raising of the eyebrow. You overestimate me. I could probably pass the first few stages without too much trouble, but winning the UA Sports Festival is a pretty big deal. Especially in third year. Did I accidentally befriend UA's secret powerhouse? Dazai joked. Finally, Oda gave in to his silent pleas. My quirk is called Flawless, he began. It allows me to see 5 seconds into the future whenever I'm in danger, or in a high-stakes situation. Nodding slowly, Dazai pondered over it for a moment. At first glance, Flawless didn't sound like anything particularly groundbreaking. Time travel quirks were rare, but not as unusual as they had once been. And Flawless had a 5-second limit attached to it, making it quite a reactionary power. Consider the implications, however, of fighting someone with such an ability, and Flawless appeared in a whole new light. Spars are fast-paced and intense. That is the very nature of the things. Unless one was using a long, drawn-out kind of strategy, no single action would take longer than 5 seconds to perform. This ultimately gave Oda a perfect understanding of any battle. With even a tenth of the martial arts training of his opponent, he could likely use Flawless to take down anyone. That quirk is, Dazai trailed off. I know, Ango concurred, propelling his spinning chair away from the desk with his legs. Anyone else would have used it as a one-way ticket to the hero course years ago. I'm a pacifist, Oda stated, simply. That was when the bell rung, reminding Dazai that lessons did, in fact, exist and were, in fact, compulsory. Dazai hopped up from the table, and the three began to make their way out of the library. Funny that pacifist contains the word fist. His friends laughed at that, and Dazai couldn't even find it within himself to be disappointed at missing lunch. Those who are watching. In the case of Mori guy, Teehee's sun was shining in Yokohama on the opening day of the UA Sports Festival. Its rays reflected off gleaming windows and glass towers, creating gorgeous patterns and broken rainbows of color. It was almost a shame, Mori thought, that the city looked so divine when, for the first time in months, he was venturing out of it. Sliding into the plush leather seat of his car, Mori let one of his men shut the door behind him. Koyo was already seated, elegantly, beside him. She was nursing a cup of tea. Not a drop spilled over the side as the car rumbled to life, the driver smoothly pulling out into the road. "You must be excited to see your protégé in action," Koyo said, almost bitterly, before taking a sip of her steaming beverage. A silk kimono fanned out over legs. "And you as well. Chuuya-kun has been flourishing under your care." Koyo frowned a little at that. "Remind me why exactly we're traveling into Tokyo for this. Risking not only ourselves, but the covers of these very so-called protégés?" Mori laughed. "I take actions that I pertain will contribute to our triumph. And I believe that meeting this old acquaintance of mine may be the difference between victory and defeat." In the case of Shigaraki Tamura, Teehee television was stat-icky again. And no matter how much Kurogyari adjusted the antenna, it wasn't making any difference. "Perhaps I could try?" Akutagawa offered, expression neutral. "No, you could not try. You're the reason we don't have a fucking flat screen anymore," Shigaraki replied, bitterly. The last time Akutagawa had attempted to fix the television, he had only succeeded in proving that he had absolutely no understanding of modern technology. And that was a kind way of putting it. He had just blasted a hole through the thing with his stupid coat and then stood looking vaguely proud of himself. Back then, they'd had a sleek, flat-screen TV set up on the wall above the bar. Now they were stuck with this 18th-century-looking relic. Finally, with a delicate shake, the monitor jolted into life. The broadcast was already well into the pre-festival adverts. A grinning little boy holding an All Might action figure flickered across the screen. "Glad to see we didn't miss anything important," Shigaraki grumbled. He took a sip of the apple juice Kurogyari had served him, in a shot glass. "It seems not," Kurogyari agreed, although he appeared to have taken quite an interest in the shampoo advertisement playing on the screen. It was a few minutes later that the actual show began, and Shigaraki was suddenly confronted with the opening scenes of the first-year UA Sports Festival. He leant against the bar, eyes narrowed as he watched the broadcast flash through various pixelated images. "These two fuckers that you're so obsessed with better blow my mind, Kurogyari," he said. "Sensei won't be happy if you were found out by a couple of blazing idiots." "You will understand when you see them, Shigaraki Tamura," Kurogyari replied, casually as he wiped down the surface of the bar. "They remind me of him in some ways. They are different from the rest." In the case of Fukuzawa Yukichi, Teehee air at UA was fresh, cleaned for the city and rejuvenating. Fukuzawa wasn't generally someone who believed in any superstitions, but the crisp wind made him feel positive nonetheless. The UA Sports Festival was a significant date on the communal wall calendar in the break room at the Armed Detective Agency. For most of his subordinates, this was because it provided a company-paid opportunity to sightsee in central Tokyo. For Fukuzawa, it was the only time he could reach outside of Yokohama in his recruitment efforts. UA's internship program was popular amongst all heroics agencies, and his own was no exception. Plus, his attempts at increasing the agency's numbers within Yokohama had not been fruitful. He came to a stop in front of the imposing form of the sports arena. It was an Olympic-sized monster, casting a dark shadow over the crowded entranceway. "Tuaha!" Yasano breathed out. "How nostalgic." "You say that every year," Ranpo laughed. He was never all that interested in the proceedings of the sports festival, and usually had to be bribed with sweets to sit through the whole thing. Fukuzawa kept him close at hand anyway. One never knows when something important may be churning away under the surface. A level at which only the agency's top detective could see. It's huge, Tanizaki gasped in awe. Fukuzawa supposed it was a fair reaction for a child from the local public school, which was not nearly as extravagant as any capital city institution, let alone the prestigious UA, of all places. He had opted to leave Kanikida in charge of the agency and its remaining members back home. A part of him did regret this decision. After all, things simply seemed to run smoother with Kanikida around. He was something of a grounding presence, compared to the other members. This group in particular, with the exception of Tanizaki, who just looked happy to be here, could be a miraculous or dangerous mix. Fukuzawa sighed. Too late to turn back now. My only order for you all is to search through what will surely be a wonderful pool of talent for those who best suit our agency and values. These may not be the obvious choices, but they will certainly be there. He approached the looming doors of the arena. Let's go. In the case of Arthur Rimbaud, IT was an old shop, out of place on the modern highway it resided in. One of those places that never seemed to have any customers, but had effortlessly stood the test of time against all the odds. Peering through a stained window, Arthur could make out a row of televisions. They were playing a variety of channels, one showed home cooking, and another an action movie. But Arthur had his eyes fixed on the screen in the center of the display. It was, after all, playing the only show worth watching at this time of year. The UA Sports Festival was a little bittersweet for Arthur. At times, he detested the hero world with such an intensity that it felt like a physical ache. He bathed in the knowledge that he had always stayed far away from it. But at other times, a little twinge of regret would well up inside him, like a single drop of blood from the prick of a needle. It was a sort of greed and longing that he could never truly repress. Hoping to catch a glimpse of the distinctive red hair from that night in the park, Arthur continued to watch as the introductory announcements played. Unfortunately, it didn't look like they'd be getting to the sports anytime soon. He began to slink away from the shop front, disappointed. A flash of color caught his eye on one of the monitors, and he paused. The offending video was showing the news channel. An image, blurry to the point of unrecognizable, took up most of the screen, and a headline ran underneath in a vivid blue. Vigilante turned villain, Stain the hero killer sighted in Tokyo. Arthur let out a breathy laugh. Between Stain the hero killer and the League of Villains, the world really had become a dangerous place.